47 starving women, 11 children with swollen bellies, not a single man, and a dying fire in the center of the camp that no one dares to rekindle, because for them, an extinguished fire means the end of the world. And he sits on the bare ground with a dead phone and a piece of obsidian on which a single word is burned in Korean. Oh, madness. The pain comes before consciousness. His skin burns as if it had been torn off and stretched back on again. Daniel opens his eyes and sees 6 spears pointed at his face. The youngest one, with a scar across her eyebrow, is already raising her spear. But the oldest one barks something in a foreign language, and the blade drops. Daniel sits up. His hands are intact. He's clutching his phone in his right hand. The screen is cracked, but still lit. 4%. No signal. He looks up and sees 2 moons above him. One is big and yellow. The other is small and blue. He stares upward for 3 seconds, then at the women with spears, then upward again. His brain refuses to accept it, but his body already senses that the air here is different, heavier, colder. It smells like a world where there has never been gasoline, plastic, or coffee. Daniel L. raises his palms. I'm unarmed. I'm no enemy. This gesture is understood in any world. The elder woman tilts her head, a heavy braid down to her waist, a scar on her collarbone. Her eyes are gray like stones at the bottom of a river. She looks at him the way one looks at an object found by the roadside, useful or not, keep or throw away. Daniel recognizes that look. He's seen it in Malawi, in Cambodia. The look of people who have nothing left but the choice of whom to feed and whom not to. He takes out of the car half a protein bar. He breaks off a piece, puts it in his mouth, chews. He holds out the other half to the older woman. She doesn't take it, but she doesn't hit him either. That's a start. They lead him to the camp. 7 huts made of branches and animal skins huddle in a rocky crevice by the river. The wind blows right through them. In the center is an empty hearth. The ashes are cold, at least 2 days. The women are eating raw meat. They cut it into thin strips and chew slowly. Daniel counts automatically, an engineer's habit. 47 adults, 11 girls, not a single boy, not a single man besides him. The entire tribe. And that's when he notices the most important thing. No one is stoking the fire. They're just waiting. A frail old woman with eyes like 2 black embers approaches and pokes him in the chest with a stick, in the stomach, in the arms. She feels his palms. She grunts. His palms are soft, not the palms of a hunter. The palms of a man who sat at a table and stared at a screen. The old woman throws something to the others, and the tone makes everything clear. He's useless. The night gnaws at his bones with cold. They give him neither a pelt nor food. Daniel opens his phone's photo gallery. 1 photo. Mom is smiling. Grandpa is holding a piece of kimchi with chopsticks and pretending to be angry. The photo is 4 years old. The screen turns off on its own. 2%. In his left hand, Daniel clutches something else. A black shard of obsidian that he was holding when he woke up in the ravine. It's warm, even in this cold. The veins glow faintly in the darkness and form a pattern. Korean letters. 2 syllables. A promise. To whom? Why? He doesn't know. Sleep overtakes him instantly. In his dream, a woman in white stands in the fog and says a single phrase. You must make it in time. Before the 3rd winter, they're coming. Daniel is dying to ask who they are, but the dream shatters and the morning hits him with its cold. He spends the entire 2nd day watching, silently. He doesn't interfere. 3 groups of 5 set out at dawn and return around noon, sometimes with a reindeer, sometimes with a couple of hares, sometimes with nothing. The spears are crude, stone tips on sinews, not a single bow. Daniel does the math in his head. 1 deer feeds them for 2 days. They hunt once every 3 or 4 days. That means they go hungry every third day. He looks at the children. Thin arms, swollen bellies, dull hair. He'd seen bellies like that in Malawi, on children who ate nothing but protein-free porridge. They drink raw water from the river. Half of the children are coughing. 2 of the women have sores on their hands, an intestinal infection. The huts let in both wind and rain. These aren't homes, they're just the outlines of homes. And the hearth lies dead, and no one tries to rekindle it. Later, he'll understand why. For them, fire is born only from fire. If the embers have gone out, it means the gods have taken away the light. It means the end. That's what they were taught. And for 2 days now, they've been freezing, eating raw food, and waiting for the cold, or the wolves, or the Red Bull to finish what they started 3 years ago. On the second evening, the youngest one approaches him, 3 years old, barefoot, wearing a pelt that's too big for her. She sits down beside him and holds out a piece of raw meat the size of a finger. Her share. Daniel freezes. The girl is 3 years old, and she's giving the only thing she has to a stranger from the ravine. He takes the meat, breaks it in half into his mouth, half back to her. The girl eats it and runs away. And something clicks inside him. It falls into place like a cog. His grandfather's voice rings clearly in his head. A well-fed person is kind. A hungry person is a beast. Make sure people have enough to eat. Daniel stands up. Enough watching. The morning of the third day is gray. Fog creeps across the rocks. The elder woman stands by the dead hearth. Daniel approaches. He pokes his finger into the hearth. Then he cups his hands and spreads them apart, mimicking a flame. The old priestess nearby laughs, shortly and maliciously. Fire is born only from fire, stranger. Every child knows that. Daniel silently takes the bow from the huntress. She snatches the weapon back. The elder nods. The huntress hands it back. He grabs a dry stick, a flat slat, and peels off the bark. He breaks off a piece of tinder fungus from a dead tree trunk. He wraps the string around the stick. He presses it into the notch, and he pulls the bow back and forth. The stick spins. 1 minute, nothing. 2, it smells like burnt wood. 3, a thin wisp of smoke creeps upward. The women lean forward, all 47 of them. Even the children come out of their huts. Even the one with the scar drops her knife. 4 minutes. His arm muscles are on fire. Sweat drips onto the wood. 5, 6. The smoke grows thicker. 7. And then he sees it. A tiny red dot in the black dust. An ember. Alive. Daniel holds his breath. He carefully moves it into a handful of birch bark. He brings it to his mouth. He blows. Gently. Just as his grandfather taught him to stoke the coals in the brazier in the yard. More. More. The tinder smolders. It turns red. It flares up. Fire is born in his palms. Not from another fire, from wood and air and movement. From nothing. Complete silence. 47 women and 11 girls hold their breath. The old priestess drops her staff, and the thud against the stones is the only sound in the world. The elder drops to one knee, not before him, before the fire. Daniel places the burning tinder in the hearth. He adds branches. The flame rises, yellow, alive, warm. It illuminates their faces, and the eyes of the wolves, driven into a corner, suddenly become the eyes of people who have remembered what warmth feels like. The eldest looks up at him, and for the first time, there is no calculation in her gaze. There is something else for which there is probably no word in her language. Daniel coughs from the smoke and thinks one thing. Grandfather, you see? I've just become Prometheus to 47 women with spears, and next will come salt, and bread, and everything else. After the fire, everything changed. Not immediately, not entirely, but the atmosphere in the camp had shifted. The women no longer looked through Daniel as if he were a void. Now they looked at him, warily, curiously, with that hungry attention with which a cornered beast looks at the hand that might give it food or might strike it. For the first 3 days after the fire, Daniel did nothing new. He sat by the hearth and tended the flames. He added branches. He made sure the embers didn't go out. The women brought kindling and stacked it nearby, in silence. This was the first form of cooperation. Not yet trust, just calculation. He knows how to make a fire, so let him live. The eldest woman, whose name was Yuna-Se, assigned him a spot by the hearth. He could sleep there. He could eat whatever was left after everyone else had eaten. His status was lower than that of the youngest girl in the tribe. Daniel didn't object. He ate the scraps of sinew and cartilage that the women threw away. He gnawed on them by the fire and thought. He thought about food, about water, about shelter, about winter, which, according to his calculations, was 4 moons away. 4 months to save 58 people from starvation. There was no time. On the 4th day after the fire, he began to learn the language. He would point at an object and look questioningly. Water, stone, fire, tree, meat, hand, foot, sky, moon. The only one who answered him from the very first day was the little scout Mi-Rae, 16 years old, quick as a fox. She talked nonstop. She would sit down next to him and chatter away, pointing at everything around them. This is Han. This is water. This is Kor. That's stone. This is Ta. That's fire. Daniel repeated them. He mispronounced them. Mi-Rae giggled and corrected him. By the end of the first moon, he knew about 100 words. Enough to say, I want water, and this is good meat, and where is the river? Not enough to explain what he was going to do next. But with each passing day, his vocabulary grew. The language of the gray moon was simple. Short words, few abstractions. No word for future. No word for plan. There is a word for tomorrow, but it also means maybe, as if the language itself didn't believe that tomorrow would ever come. On the 7th day, Daniel found salt. More precisely, he found a way to get it. He walked along the river, searching for what he knew from his former life. Certain plants, certain types of rock, salt flats. He didn't find any salt flats, but he found something else. A thicket of saltwort at a bend in the river, dense, waist high. He plucked a stem, rubbed it between his fingers, sniffed it, licked it. A slightly bitter, alkaline taste. The ashes of saltbush contain potassium and sodium salts, not table salt in its pure form, but close enough to change the taste of food. He gathered an armful of saltbush, brought it back to camp, dried it by the fire. He burned it to ashes. He poured water over the ashes in a stone hollow. He strained it through a bundle of grass. The murky liquid flowed into another hollow. Daniel placed it over the fire. After 3 hours, the water had boiled away. A grayish-white crust remained at the bottom. He scraped it off. He tasted it on his tongue. Salty and bitter, coarse, but it was salt. He took the crust to Yuna-Se. She tasted it. Her eyes widened. She said something quickly and sharply. The women gathered around. Each one tasted a grain. Daniel didn't understand all the words, but he got the gist. They had run out of salt 2 months ago. Meat without salt would spoil in a day. Meat with salt could be dried and stored for weeks. Salt isn't a seasoning. Salt is life. Yuna-Se looked at Daniel for a long time. Then she turned to the others and said 3 words he already knew. He's staying. Halmo was displeased. The old priestess watched Daniel like a crow watches a stranger who has entered its territory. She saw the women bringing him firewood. She saw Mi-Rae sitting next to him and laughing. She saw Yuna-Se tasting his salt. And each time, her black, coal-like eyes narrowed even further. On the 8th day, she approached Daniel by the hearth. She poked the fire with a stick. Then she poked him with the stick. And she spoke. At length. Angrily. Daniel understood little, but he understood enough. The fire belongs to Mother Moon. You stole it. You're a stranger. You're a man. Men bring death. She'd seen it. The men of the Red Bull came and killed everyone. Now another man has come and is doing strange things. What will happen next? Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he did what his grandfather had taught him. He bowed. Low. The way elders are bowed to in Korea. His forehead was almost touching the ground. Halmo fell silent. In this world, men didn't bow. Men took. Men hit. Men gave orders. But this one was kneeling before an old woman, his forehead touching the dirt. Halmo silently turned away and left. It wasn't acceptance. It was a pause. Daniel began building a kiln on the 10th day. He found clay by the river, rich, dark, good clay. He mixed it with sand and chopped grass for strength. He began to mold it. The base was round, the walls were thick, a dome with a smoke hole. He made the chimney out of 3 clay cylinders, nested one inside the other. He worked for 4 days. The women watched. Some came closer. Ka-Yeon was the first to approach. 22 years old, broad shoulders, steady hands, left-handed. She watched as Daniel kneaded the clay. Then she silently sat down next to him and began kneading as well. Her hands were stronger. The clay yielded more easily to her. Daniel showed her the proportions. This much clay, this much sand, this much grass. She nodded. She didn't smile, but she didn't leave either. 3 more women followed her. By the end of the day, the kiln was growing 4 times faster. On the 14th day, the kiln was ready. Daniel let it dry for 2 more days. Then he lit a small fire inside, slowly, carefully, so the clay wouldn't crack from the sudden heat. The fire burned all day. By evening, the kiln's walls were red hot and began to radiate warmth. Even, gentle. Not like a campfire that burns on one side while you freeze on the other. The kiln warmed like a living creature. Daniel called out to Yuna-Se. She approached. She reached out her hand toward the wall. It was warm. Then she walked around the stove. It was warm everywhere. She looked up. The smoke rose up the chimney and dissipated above the trees. Not into her eyes, not into her lungs. Up and away. In the huts where bonfires were burning, everyone was coughing. The smoke stung their eyes and throats. Here it was warm and clean. Yuna-Se stood by the kiln and said nothing. For a long time. Then she said 1 word. Daniel didn't know it, but he understood from her tone. More. Build another one. 3 days later, he began building the second stove. This time, Ka-Yeon supervised the mixing of the clay herself. She had memorized the proportions on her first try. Daniel just demonstrated the shape and kept an eye on the chimney. The second oven was finished in 2 days. They built the third in a day and a half. Now there were 3 ovens in the camp, 3 sources of heat, 3 places where they could dry meat and heat water. Daniel stood by the 3rd oven and counted in his head. 3 ovens, 47 women, 11 children. 4 months until winter. We need walls. We need a roof. We need food that doesn't run out in 2 days. We need grain. He remembered what he'd seen in the forest on the 2nd day when he'd been walking along the river. Tall stalks with heavy spikes, wild spelt, or something very much like it. It grew in patches in sunny clearings, small, tough, but it was grain. In the morning, he went looking for it. He found 3 clearings with wild spelt an hour's walk from camp. The ears were green, not ripe yet. 2 moons until harvest, maybe 3. He broke off a few stalks and brought them back to camp. He showed them to Yuna-Se. She twirled the spikelet between her fingers. She picked out a single grain, small, hard, useless in her opinion. She looked at him with an expression he had already learned to read. Why? Daniel couldn't explain it in words. He knew 100 words. The word bread wasn't among them. The word flour wasn't there. The word future didn't exist in this language. He took a handful of old seeds he'd found in one of the clearings, dry, from last year. He placed them between 2 flat stones and began to grind, the top stone against the bottom one, in circular motions, slowly. The grains crackled and crumbled. 10 minutes later, there was a handful of coarse dust between the stones, grayish yellow. Daniel added water. He kneaded the dough, flat, lumpy, terrible. He shaped a flatbread the size of his palm. He placed it on the scorching wall of the oven. The smell appeared 3 minutes later, an unfamiliar smell for this world, the smell of roasted grain. The women began to turn their heads. Mi-Rae ran up first and sniffed like a little fox. 10 minutes later, the flatbread had hardened, black, crooked, sour to the taste, tough as a shoe sole. But it was bread. The first bread in the world of Arkhai. Daniel broke off a piece of the flatbread. He gave a piece to Yuna-Se. She chewed slowly, for a long time, and something happened to her face. Something cracked in the stone mask she had worn for 3 years without taking it off. She closed her eyes, and Daniel understood. She remembered. A taste from her childhood. A taste she hadn't had in 17 years. When she opened her eyes, they were wet. She didn't say a word. She clenched what was left of the flatbread in her fist and walked over to the sacred stone where she spoke with her dead mother every morning. Tae-Ri didn't try the bread. She sat off to the side and looked at Daniel with that same gaze. Hatred, contempt, fear. 19 years old, a scar across her eyebrow from a bear's claw. The best archer in the tribe, even though there were no bows here. The best spear thrower. Fast. Vicious. She didn't speak to him. She didn't look his way when he spoke. She spat on the ground when he walked by. Mi-Rae once whispered to Daniel why. Tae-Ri's mother was among the women whom Red Bull took as concubines. Tae-Ri heard her mother scream. She had been in a tree hollow at the time, along with Mi-Rae and 3 other girls. They hid there for 2 days. When they climbed out, Tae-Ri's mother was already far away. That was 3 years ago. Ever since then, Tae-Ri had been sharpening her knife every evening and had never once uttered the word mother. Daniel listened and remained silent. He didn't try to approach her. He didn't try to speak. He simply noticed one thing. Her fingers. When she threw the spear, the fingers of her right hand were bleeding. The skin was torn off her knuckles. She was gripping the shaft too tightly. Her hand would slip. The skin would tear. She didn't wrap her hand because there was no bandage material. Daniel remembered this. By the end of the first moon, the camp had changed. 3 fire pits stood in a row. Each had a roof made of branches and hides to keep the rain from dousing the fire. Daniel showed them how to dry meat in thin strips on hot stones near the fire pit. The meat, seasoned with salt from the quinoa, dried in 2 days and could be stored for a week, maybe 2. This meant that a successful hunt now provided food not for 2 days, but for 5. He showed them how to boil water. It was simple. Just lower the stones from the fire pit into a stone bowl of water. The stones sizzled. The water bubbled. After 10 days of drinking boiled water, the children stopped coughing. Not all of them, but half. Halmo noticed this. She didn't say anything to Daniel, but he saw her standing by the bowl of boiled water, staring at it for a long time, thinking. On the last day of the first moon, Daniel sat down by the hearth and took out a piece of birch bark, a charred stick, and began to write. In Korean, in small letters, everything he could remember. How to build a furnace, how to make fire, how to obtain salt, how to boil water, how to dry meat, how to identify poisonous berries, how to recognize wild spelt, the proportions of clay for the oven, the firing temperature, everything, every detail, in case he died tomorrow, in case he forgot. A diary of civilization, the first page. He wrote until dark. Then he took out his phone, 1%, the last of it. He opened a photo of his mom and grandpa. He looked at it for 10 seconds. The screen flickered and went dark. Forever. Daniel held the dead phone in his hands and stared at the black glass, which reflected a foreign sky with 2 moons. He didn't cry. Not yet. The tears would come at night, 3 nights in a row, quietly, so that no one would hear. But Yuna-Se would hear, and he wouldn't say a word, just that in the morning, a pelt would be lying where he'd been, warm, soft, a wolf's, the best in the camp. The second moon began with rain, cold and vicious. It had been falling for 3 days straight. The river had risen and flooded 2 huts at the bottom of the ravine. The women were hauling the hides and the children higher up the slope. Daniel helped. He carried wet hides and bundles of firewood. His arms were weaker than any of theirs. He was gasping for breath after every climb. Tae-Ri walked past him, carrying 2 bundles on her shoulders, each weighing more than he did. She didn't even glance in his direction. But Ka-Yeon slowed down beside him and, without a word, took one of the bundles from him. She simply took it and carried on, not out of pity, out of practicality. He was slow, she was fast. They had to weather the rain. When the water receded, Daniel realized the shelters were no longer fit for purpose. Branches and hides. This is no home. It was a shelter. Any rain, any wind, any snow blew right through. In winter, people would freeze to death in such shelters. They needed walls, real walls, clay, stone, wood. He began to think about a palisade. But first came the potter's wheel. Daniel had been thinking about it since the very first week. The women stored water in skin water bags. The skins leaked. The skins stank. The skins rotted after a month. There were clay pots in the tribe, but there were only 4 of them. Old, cracked, precious, hand-molded and fired in a fire, crooked and fragile. It took 3 days to make 1 pot. Daniel could change that. He found a suitable stone, flat, round, heavy. He shaped it in a day. He drove a thick stake into the ground. He mounted the stone on the stake so that it would spin, primitive, rough, but the wheel spun. He sat down in front of it. He placed a lump of clay in the center. He spun the stone with his hand. The clay flowed beneath his fingers. The first pot turned out ugly, crooked. The walls were of varying thickness. The bottom was slanted. But it was a pot made in 20 minutes instead of 3 days. Daniel fired it in the kiln. The pot didn't crack. He poured water into it. The water didn't leak. He placed the pot in front of Yuna-Se. She picked it up, turned it over in her hands, tapped the side with her fingernail. The sound was dull and even. She set the pot on the ground and looked at the potter's wheel, then at Daniel, then back at the wheel. She didn't smile. She never smiled at all, but her eyes said what her mouth couldn't. Make some more. Ka-Yeon mastered the potter's wheel in 2 days. By the 3rd day, she was making pots better than Daniel. Her hands were made for this. Large, strong, precise. The clay obeyed her as if it were alive. A week later, there were 20 new pots at the camp, different sizes, for water, for grain, for storing salt. Ka-Yeon didn't say much. She hardly ever said anything at all. But when she sat at the potter's wheel and her hands shaped the clay, Daniel saw an expression on her face he hadn't seen before. Peace. She had found her calling. One evening, she brought him a pot, a small one, with a lid. She had pressed a design into the side with a wet stick, a sun, or a star, or something in between. Daniel took the pot and placed the obsidian inside it. The stone fit inside as if the pot had been made just for it. Ka-Yeon nodded and left. It was the first gift he had received in this world. Mi-Rae found the stinging nettles. She was running around the forest as usual and brought back an armful of stinging stems simply because she'd burned her hand and felt upset. Daniel saw the nettles and froze. Nettles are fabric. In Malawi, he'd seen women weaving ropes from nettle fibers. In Cambodia, he'd seen nettle cloth, rough, stiff, but strong and warm. He picked up the stalks, soaked them in the river, beaten them with a stone, separated them into fibers, thin, long, strong. He tied 3 strands together, twisted them. It turned into twine. You could make anything out of twine. Ropes, nets, cloth. He showed Mi-Rae how to beat the stems and separate the fibers. She picked it up quickly. An hour later, they had their first spinning wheel made of a stick and a stone. A day later, their first ball of nettle thread, the size of a fist. 3 days later, Daniel had assembled the simplest loom. 4 sticks driven into the ground, threads stretched between them, a weft thread on a stick. He wove his first piece of cloth all day long. His palms burned from the nettle sap. His fingers were scraped raw. But by evening, a square of fabric the size of his palm lay before him. Coarse, gray, uneven. But it was cloth, not hide. Cloth, from a plant that grew everywhere here like a weed. Yuna-Se touched the fabric. She rubbed it between her fingers. The fabric was stiff, but didn't tear. Yuna-Se looked at Daniel and said a phrase he would remember forever. "You make things out of nothing." He shook his head. He pointed to the nettles, to the river, to the stone he'd been using to break off the stems. Not from nothing, from what had always been here. It's just that no one knew what could be made from it. Yuna-Se was silent. Then she nodded slowly. That silent nod was her way of thinking. She was taking it all in, rebuilding the world in her mind, stone by stone. Daniel taught 4 women how to weave over the next week. They sat at their looms from dawn until dusk. Their fingers bled from the stinging nettles, but every evening more fabric was added. After 2 weeks, they had enough fabric for 3 full wrappings. Not clothes, wraps. Strips of fabric they wrapped around their bodies over their hides. An extra layer, extra warmth. Daniel handed out the first wraps to the 3 women whose hides were the most tattered. They put them on and stood motionless. They touched the fabric, felt it. One of them pressed a wrap to her face and breathed. The fabric smelled of the river and grass. Not blood, not a dead animal. The river and grass. It was that very week that Daniel first saw the Red Bull Scout. Tae-Ri spotted him first. She returned from the hunt earlier than usual. Quick. Quiet. She walked straight up to Yuna-Se and spoke briefly. Daniel didn't understand everything, but he caught the words Red Bull and watch. A scout. Someone was watching the camp from a distant hill. Yuna-Se turned ashen. Her already pale face lost its last trace of color. She gathered the 5 senior female warriors and spoke with them until dark. Daniel sat by the hearth and listened. He understood every 3rd word, but that was enough. Red Bull thought Grey Moon was dead. Now he knows she isn't. 3 hearths are smoking. The smoke is visible from many paces away. Red Bull will come. Not tomorrow, not in a month, but he will come. They always finish the job. Yuna-Se knew this. Everyone knew it. Daniel saw the women's faces change when Tae-Ri brought the news. The hope that had only just begun to sprout over the past moon froze on their faces like water freezing on a rock. Instantly. He saw it and he was afraid. Not for himself, for them. For the pots and stoves and cloth and bread. For everything they had built. Everything that could be lost in a single night. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He lay on a wolf pelt and stared into the darkness. He counted. 47 women. 15 of them could fight. The rest were too old, too young, or too weak from hunger. 15 women with stone spears. According to Yuna-Se, Red Bull had 300 warriors, men, with heavy spears and stone axes. 15 against 300. Daniel closed his eyes. He recalled a photograph from a textbook he'd seen in college. A ditch and a palisade, the simplest field fortification. The Romans built these every night on the march. A ditch as deep as a man is tall. A palisade of sharpened stakes. Archers behind the palisade. Daniel opened his eyes. He couldn't build a Roman camp, but he could dig a ditch. He could sharpen the stakes. He could make bows. Real bows. Not just straight sticks with a string. Recurve bows, with a curve that gives it power. He knew how. In college, he'd been in the archery club, and once he'd made a bow out of ash wood during a workshop. There's ash wood here. He'd seen it. Daniel sat up in the darkness. For the first time ever, he wasn't thinking about food. He was thinking about war. In the morning, he went to see Yuna-Se. He already knew enough words. He spoke slowly, choosing each one carefully. They're coming. We're weak. We need a wall. Yuna-Se looked at him. He bent down and drew on the ground with a stick, a circle. Inside the circle, huts and fire pits. A line around the circle, a moat. Beyond the moat, stakes. Yuna-Se looked at the drawing, then at him, then back at the drawing. She asked one word. How many? How much time? Daniel held up 2 fingers, 2 moons. Yuna-Se was silent for a long time. Then she turned and shouted. The women gathered. Yuna-Se pointed to the drawing on the ground and spoke, briefly, firmly. She wasn't asking. She was ordering. From that day on, half the tribe hunted and wove. The other half dug. They dug the trench for 3 weeks, with stone shovels, with sticks, with their hands. Daniel dug alongside them. His palms became calloused, then blistered, then calloused again. He was the slowest, but he was there every day. Ka-Yeon worked for 2, silently, methodically. Her shovel cut into the ground evenly and deeply. Tae-Ri dug furiously, angrily, as if the trench were a grave for those who would come. Daniel watched her and thought that, in a sense, it was. The trench turned out uneven, deep in some places, shallow in others. But it was there, a semicircle from rock to rock, half a person's height deep. At the bottom, Daniel showed them how to drive sharpened stakes into the ground, points facing upward. The women cut down young trees and charred the ends in the furnace. Charred wood is harder, sharper, deadlier. Behind the trench, they erected a palisade, 2 rows of stakes driven into the ground at an angle. Not a wall, more like a fence. But anyone running into these stakes in the dark would die or be maimed. At the same time, Daniel was making bows. He cut down ash saplings, 6 of them. He dried them by the stove using a quick drying method. He shaped them with a stone knife. He bent them in a vise made of stones and rope, giving them a curve. He strung the bowstring with twisted nettle thread. The first bow snapped when drawn. The second cracked. The third held. Daniel drew it. An arrow made from a straight branch with a stone tip flew 30 paces and lodged in a tree to the depth of a finger. In a world where people knew only of spears that flew 10 paces, this was a weapon from another era. Tae-Ri saw the shot. She stood off to the side, pretending to sharpen a knife. But Daniel noticed how she followed the arrow's flight, how her eyes widened for a split second, how her fingers stopped moving the knife. He set the bow down on the ground and walked away. He didn't say a word. An hour later, Tae-Ri walked over to the bow. She picked it up. She drew it back. The arrow flew farther than his had, 40 paces. She shot again, and again. 10 arrows in a row, each one more accurate than the last. She was born for this weapon. Her hands, her eyes, her hunter's instinct. Everything came together. She put the bow back in its place and walked away without looking back. By morning, the bow was hers. She hadn't asked for permission. Daniel didn't object. By the middle of the second moon, Daniel realized he had to talk to Halmo. He couldn't avoid it. He couldn't put it off any longer. Talk to her. The old priestess had been sabotaging his every endeavor, quietly and consistently. She didn't break stoves. She didn't ruin pots. She did worse. She talked. With women. At night. By the sacred stone. Daniel hadn't heard exactly what was said, but he'd seen the result. 2 women refused to weave. They said the nettles were cursed. 3 refused to drink boiled water. They said that fire kills the spirit of water, and drinking it means angering Mother Moon. One of the elders smashed a pot. She said that clay belongs in the ground, not on the table. Small acts of resistance. Individually insignificant. Together, dangerous. Halmo wasn't stupid. She was a priestess. Her authority rested on the belief that the world operates according to certain rules. Fire is born of fire. Water is drunk raw. Food is obtained by hunting. The gods give, and the gods take away. Daniel was breaking these rules one by one. Every oven he built, every pot he made, every loaf of bread he baked, told the women that the priestess was wrong, that the world works differently, that the gods are not the only source. Halmo wasn't defending tradition. She was defending herself. Daniel went to see her that morning. She was sitting by the sacred stone. The stone was large, gray, with a circle carved into it, the moon. Halmo was smearing ochre on the stone and muttering. Daniel sat down nearby, not too close, at arm's length, and he remained silent. A minute, 2, 5. Halmo finished the ritual. She looked at him, eyes like embers, angry, watchful. Daniel spoke slowly. He already knew about 200 words and chose each one carefully. He said that the fire he makes isn't a different fire. It's the same fire, the fire of Mother Moon. It's just sleeping in the tree. And when hands rub against the wood, the fire awakens. Mother Moon placed fire in every tree, in every stone, everywhere. Halmo listened. Her eyes didn't change. He continued. He said that his stoves were a home for Mother Moon's fire, a good home, a warm one, with a chimney so the smoke could rise to the sky, to Mother Moon. Every stove is a temple, a small temple of fire. Halmo remained silent. Daniel realized he was walking a fine line. One wrong word, and the old woman would declare him an enemy of the gods. And in this world, an enemy of the gods lives only long enough to sharpen a spear. He said one last thing. He said he wanted to ask her, not to command her, to ask. When the field was sown, he wanted Halmo to bless the seeds, because without the blessing of the Mother Moon, the grain would not grow. It was a lie. The grain would grow without any blessings at all. But Halmo didn't know that. And Daniel knew what she needed. She needed to remain important, to be needed. In a world that was changing too quickly, she needed a role. Halmo looked at him for a long time. Then she snorted. She stood up. She poked him in the shoulder with her stick. It hurt, and she walked away. Daniel rubbed his shoulder. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. 3 days later, Halmo came to the field. Daniel had cleared a clearing 200 paces from the camp. He'd uprooted the bushes. He'd dug up the ground with stone hoes. He'd loosened the soil. He'd sown wild spelt. They'd spent a week gathering the seeds. Mi-Rae and the 4 girls gathered wild ears of grain in the clearings and brought the kernels back in small cloth bags. Daniel marked out the beds, the rows, the spacing between the seeds, the planting depth, all from memory, all from Malawi and Cambodia, and the textbooks he'd read in another life. When Halmo came, half the field had been sown. She stood at the edge and watched. The earth in even rows, seeds in the ground, paths between the beds. It didn't look like anything familiar. It looked like order, like a plan, like the future, a word that didn't exist in their language. Halmo walked over to the nearest bed. She knelt down, scooped up some soil, rubbed it between her fingers, sniffed it, and began to sing, softly, low. A song that Daniel didn't understand, but that sent shivers down his spine. The women stopped working. They listened. Halmo sang and smeared the soil with ochre, red spots on the black earth. A blessing. When she finished, she stood up and looked at Daniel. For the first time, without malice. With something else. With something resembling cautious curiosity. She said one sentence. "If it grows, I'll believe." Daniel nodded. It will grow. In the middle of the second moon, Sora arrived. Daniel was the first to see her because he was on watch at the edge of the moat. 3 figures at the edge of the forest, a woman and 2 small children. The woman was walking with great difficulty, barely able to move her legs. She was carrying one child in her arms. The other was clinging to her skirt. Daniel shouted. Tae-Ri and 2 female warriors ran out with spears. They approached. They saw them. They lowered their weapons. The woman fell to her knees right in front of the moat. She was speaking, but the words were different. A different dialect. A different tribe. Daniel didn't understand a thing. Tae-Ri understood. She listened. Her face darkened with every word. Then she turned to Yuna-Se, who had followed behind. They spoke quickly. Daniel caught snippets. Black otter, slaughtered. The men were killed. The women were taken. She ran. She walked for 7 days. The children hadn't eaten for 3 days. Yuna-Se ordered water and meat to be brought. Sora ate like a wild animal, with her hands. She choked. She cried and ate at the same time. The children ate in silence. The boy was about 4 years old. The girl was about 2. The boy had the eyes of an old man. He had seen things a 4-year-old should never see. Sora was 27 years old, but she looked 40. Her hair was white, not gray with age, but white with horror. Her hands trembled even as she ate. She spoke little. For the first 3 days, she didn't speak at all. She sat with the children in the corner of the tent and stared straight ahead. Daniel didn't approach her. He didn't touch her. He didn't comfort. He knew that in such a state, a person needs only one thing: safety, walls, silence, time. He asked Yuna-Se to set aside a separate tent for her. Yuna-Se agreed. Daniel brought a warm fur there, a pot of water, a bowl of dried meat, and 2 flatbreads. He placed them by the entrance. He didn't go inside. Sora took the food after he left. On the 4th day, she came out. She stood by the hearth, warming her hands, in silence. Daniel stood nearby, also silent. 2 people who didn't need words. On the 5th day, she began to help with the weaving, in silence. Her fingers were nimble, quick. She wove the nettle threads as if she'd been doing it her whole life. Sora was the first, but not the last. At the end of the second moon, 3 more women arrived, from another tribe, also slaughtered, also by the Red Bull. 3 moons later, 5 more, with children. Daniel understood the pattern. The Red Bull wasn't just attacking, he was systematically destroying neighboring tribes, one after another. He took the women, he killed the men. Those who fled, he left to die. And they died, all of them, except for those who made it to the smoke. The 3 hearths of gray moon smoked every day. The smoke rose above the trees. It could be seen from half a day's journey away. For Red Bull, it was a challenge. For the fugitives, it was a beacon. By the end of the second moon, the tribe already had 53 women and 14 children. 6 new mouths to feed. 6 new hands. Daniel took stock of their supplies. 10 days' worth of dried meat. Salt for 2 weeks. The grain hadn't grown yet. 2 moons until the first harvest. Hunting provided food, but with every new mouth to feed, hunting provided less. More was needed. More of everything was needed. He sat by the hearth at night and wrote on birch bark. He calculated. He planned. He drew diagrams, snares for hares, fish traps, a weir on the river for easy fishing, nets made of nettle thread, a fish drying rack, a smokehouse. Every idea required hands. There weren't enough hands. There was even less time. He decided to start with the fish. The river was 200 paces away. He saw fish in the river, large ones. Women did not catch fish. In their culture, fish was considered unclean food, the food of outcasts and the damned. Daniel asked Yuna-Se why. She answered simply, "Fish live in water. Water is the blood of Mother Moon. To eat the blood of the goddess is to drink the blood of the goddess." Daniel suppressed the urge to explain that this was superstition. Instead, he went back to Halmo. He told her that fish were not the blood of Mother Moon. Fish were a gift from Mother Moon, like a deer, like a hare. Mother Moon put the fish in the water so the children could eat. Would a mother ever deny her children food? Halmo looked at him. She squinted. She knew he was being sly. He knew she knew. But the children were hungry, and Halmo was old and wise. Wisdom is knowing how to change the rules without breaking them. She said that if the fish were purified by the fire of Mother Moon, and if she personally performed the purification rite, then it would be allowed. Daniel nodded. A day later, he wove his first net. 2 days later, he pulled 7 fish out of the river. Each one was the size of a forearm. Halmo recited the purification rite over them. The fish were roasted on the stove. The children ate so quickly that Daniel feared they would choke. The boy Sorai, little Inho, ate an entire fish and fell asleep right on the ground by the hearth. Sora covered him with a hide, and for the first time ever, her face wasn't blank. There was something there. Perhaps peace. Perhaps the beginning of peace. In the last days of the second moon, Daniel did one more thing. At night, in secret. He took a piece of tanned leather, soft, deer leather. He took out some nettle thread and a bone needle he'd carved from a fishbone. And he began to sew. He was sewing gloves, 2 of them, for one hand, for a specific hand. 3 days ago, he had quietly taken Teddy's glove when she left them by the drying rack. He measured it, memorized it, put it back. Now he was sewing gloves that covered the palm and fingers but left the tips free for the bowstring. Soft on the inside, sturdy on the outside. Reinforced at the knuckles where the leather tore from gripping the spear. He sewed for 3 nights. His fingers were pricked by the needle, but the gloves turned out well. He placed them on her spear that morning and left. He didn't wait. That afternoon, he saw her at the edge of the ditch. She was wearing the gloves. She was shooting her bow, arrow after arrow. Her fingers weren't bleeding. Her grip was firm and gentle. She didn't look in his direction. She didn't say a word. But she never took the gloves off again. Never. The third moon was the moon of work. Hard, monotonous, endless work. Daniel rose before dawn and went to bed after dark. The field had to be watered. The ditch had to be deepened. The palisade had to be reinforced. Fish had to be caught. Meat had to be dried. Nettles had to be gathered and woven. The pots had to be fired. And all of this at the same time. And there weren't enough hands to go around. For the first time in his life, Daniel truly understood what logistics meant. Not on paper, but in the mud, sweat, and calluses. In the office, he used to draw resource charts on the screen. Here, he was assigning 43 able-bodied women to 12 tasks, and each task was a matter of life and death. He set up a tracking system, sticks with notches. Each stick represented one task. Each notch represented one day. Red ochre meant it was done. Black charcoal meant it wasn't. Yuna-Se looked at his sticks, and there was something new in her eyes. Not surprise, understanding. She began to carry her own stick with her, her own notches, her own tally. Who was out hunting? Who was in the fields? Who was at the moat? She learned his language. He taught her to count. Counting turned out to be the hardest part. In the language of the gray moon, there were 3 numbers. 1, 2, many. Anything more than 2 was many. 7 fish is many fish. 20 pots is many pots. 300 enemies is many enemies. There was no distinction in the language between 20 pots and 300 enemies. Daniel began teaching Yuna-Se the numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He pointed to his fingers, then to stones. Then he drew with a stick on the ground. Yuna-Se absorbed it all, quickly, eagerly. She was smarter than most of the people Daniel had known in his former world. It was just that no one had ever explained anything to her. By the 3rd day, she could count to 20. By the 5th, to 100. By the 10th, she took inventory of the tribe's supplies and told Daniel the result. 42 pieces of dried meat, 18 pots of salt, 6 bundles of dried fish, 11 skeins of nettle thread. Daniel looked at her and thought that in another world, this woman would be a general, or a president, or a damn CEO. Here, she was the leader of 53 hungry women with stone spears, and she tallied her resources just as he tallied his in the office. The only difference was that survival depended on her calculations, not a quarterly report. Mi-Rae was also learning to count, but she was more interested in something else. Words. She wanted to know all the words. Every evening, she would sit down next to Daniel and ask, "What's water in your language? What's fire? What's moon? What's mother?" Daniel would answer in Korean. Mi-Rae would repeat them. She'd get them wrong. She laughed. She tried again. She collected words the way other girls collected berries, with eagerness and delight. One day, she asked how to say friend. Daniel said, "Chingu." Mi-Rae repeated it. "Chingu." Then she pointed her finger at him, then at herself. "Chingu." Daniel smiled. The smile came with difficulty because his throat tightened. He nodded. At the beginning of the 3rd moon, Daniel planted the 2nd field. It was larger than the 1st. In this field, he planted more than just spelt. He found wild peas, small, tough. But peas are protein. They're nitrogen for the soil. They're crop rotation. He found wild onions, sharp, pungent, so hot they brought tears to his eyes. But onions are vitamins. They're a cure for scurvy. They're flavor. He found something resembling wild turnips. A root vegetable, fleshy, bitter when raw, but when cooked, starchy and filling. He planted the 2nd field with everything he'd found. Peas, onions, turnips, spelt, in separate rows, in the proper rotation. Halmo came uninvited. She gave her blessing in silence. Then she left. It was a yes in a language where yes isn't spoken aloud. The first spelt crop in the first field sprouted in the third week of the third moon. Green shoots, thin, fragile, but alive. Daniel stood at the edge of the field and watched them. A green strip on black earth. In this world, no one had ever seen anything like it. Food that grows from the ground. Not a deer you have to chase down and kill. Not a fish you have to catch. Food that simply grows. On its own. From the seeds you planted in the ground. Yuna-Se came and stood beside him. They both looked at the sprouts in silence. Yuna-Se asked quietly, "They'll grow." No question, a statement that asked for confirmation. Daniel replied, "Yes, if it rains, if the sun shines, if the animals don't eat them, yes." Yuna-Se nodded. Then she did something she'd never done before. She sat down on the ground. Just sat down, not crouching, not on a rock, on the ground next to the garden bed. And she sat there. A minute, two. Daniel sat down beside her. They sat at the edge of the field and listened to the wind rustling the sprouts. It was the quietest moment since he'd arrived here. Yuna-Se said one word, quietly, so quietly that he almost didn't hear it. "Thank you." She'd learned that word from Mi-Rae, in Korean, 감사합니다. She pronounced it harshly and staccato, just as she pronounced everything, as if the word were a stone she'd hurled. But it was thank you. The first thank you he'd heard in this world. The gloves had changed Tae-Ri. Not right away, not completely, but something had shifted. She no longer spat when he walked by. She didn't carve the table with a knife. She ignored him, but it was a different kind of ignoring. Before, she'd ignored him like an enemy not worth noticing. Now, she ignored him like a person you could simply be silent around. The difference was enormous. Daniel noticed and took the next step. He started making arrows. Lots of arrows. Every evening. He cut straight alder branches. He planed them. He smoothed them. He fitted them with stone tips. He tied on fletching made from feathers he'd gathered by the river. The arrows weren't perfect, but each one flew straight. He made 5 a day and stacked them by the ditch. Tae-Ri would take them in the morning, silently, without a word. She'd take them and shoot them. She'd check each one. She'd return some, crooked, heavy, not right. Daniel would look at the rejected ones and understand what was wrong. He'd fix them. The next day, all the arrows passed inspection. It was a dialogue, without words, through objects, through arrows and gloves and silence. A language in which one can speak without opening one's mouth. One night, Daniel woke up to a scream, a high-pitched, shrill, childlike scream. "Mi-Rae!" He jumped up and ran to her hut. She was curled up on the ground, screaming with her eyes closed. A nightmare. Daniel had seen such nightmares in children in Cambodia. Children who had witnessed death. Children who had hidden in tree hollows while their mothers were being killed outside. He crouched down beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't shake her. He just sat there and began to speak softly, in Korean. "It's okay. You're safe. No one will hurt you." Mi-Rae didn't understand the words, but his voice worked. Quiet, steady, monotonous. She stopped screaming. She opened her eyes. She saw him. She clung to his arm with both hands, her nails digging into his skin. She was trembling. He sat beside her until dawn. She fell asleep an hour later. He didn't pull his hand away. In the morning, he made her an amulet. He twisted some straw and tied it with nettle thread into the shape of a circle with rays, a sun, or a star. He attached a loop so it could be hung around her neck. He brought it to her. She took it. She turned it over in her hands. She asked what it was. He said it was a dream keeper. In his world, people hang these above their beds, and bad dreams get tangled up in the rays and don't reach the sleeper. Mi-Rae raised an eyebrow, skeptically, the way a 16-year-old girl looks at an adult who's talking nonsense. But she hung the amulet around her neck, and she didn't scream that night, or the next. Maybe the amulet worked. Maybe it was the knowledge that someone would come if she screamed. Daniel didn't know the difference, and there wasn't one. Daniel thought about the wall. The palisade was flimsy. The moat was shallow. If the Red Bull came in earnest, that wouldn't stop anyone. He needed a real wall, stone and clay. But for a stone wall, he needed stones, lots of stones, and time, and manpower. He started small, a rammed earth wall, a technique he'd seen in Africa. Wooden formwork, a mixture of clay, soil, and small stones packed tightly inside. It would dry and become as hard as concrete, almost, hard enough to stop a spear. He built the first section of the wall, 10 paces long, in a week. Ka-Yeon helped. She carried clay in pots and packed it down so hard the ground groaned. The wall turned out to be chest high, 2 fists thick. Daniel struck it with a stone. The wall held. He struck it with a spear. The spear sank in half a finger's length and got stuck. Good. Not perfect, but good. At the end of the third moon, what Daniel had both been waiting for and fearing happened. Tae-Ri came to him in the evening, silently. She stood opposite him. She looked at him. He waited. She held out her hand. In her hand was a fish, roasted, still warm. She placed the fish on a rock next to him. She turned away, and she left. Daniel looked at the fish, then at her back, receding into the darkness. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't gratitude. It was an acknowledgement that he existed, that he had the right to eat, that he was not an enemy. In Tae-Ri's world, it was as if someone had thrown open a window in a room that had been locked for 3 years. Not wide open, just a crack, but fresh air began to flow in. Daniel ate the fish. It was too salty and a little burnt. It was the best fish he'd ever had. The grain was growing. Every day, Daniel checked the field. The sprouts were getting stronger, stretching upward, green, stubborn, alive. The peas clung with their tendrils to the stakes he'd stuck in nearby. The onions were sprouting leaves. The turnips were putting on leaves. It was a slow miracle. A miracle that required no magic, just water, sun, soil, patience. Daniel stood at the edge of the field every evening and counted the days until harvest. 1 moon, maybe 1.5, if there are no frosts, if no animals come, if the Red Bull doesn't come first. He stood there, looking at the green sprouts and thinking of his grandfather. His grandfather used to say that the hardest part of farming is waiting. Plant it and wait. Water it and wait. You can't make the grain grow any faster. You can only do everything right and wait. Daniel waited, and while he waited, he built a wall, and made arrows, and taught Yuna-Se numbers, and listened to Mi-Rae mangle Korean words, and noticed that Halmo came to the field every morning, alone, standing at the edge. She looked at the sprouts, she touched the leaves, and she left before anyone saw her. Daniel saw her, but he didn't say anything. The dream came again, a woman in white, a face he couldn't remember, fog, a voice. You have to make it in time. Before the third winter, they're coming. This time, there was something else. Behind the woman, Daniel saw a shadow, a huge one, dark, with eyes the color of old blood. The shadow was moving, slowly, toward the north. No, from the north. The shadow was coming from the north. And it wasn't alone. Behind it were others, many others. Daniel woke up in a cold sweat. He clenched the obsidian in his fist. The stone was warm. The letters on it glowed faintly in the darkness. A promise. The third winter. They are coming. Who are they? Daniel lay in the darkness, listening to his heartbeat. Outside the wall of the hut, Tae-Ri was patrolling the palisade. Ka-Yeon snored softly in the neighboring hut. Mi-Rae slept peacefully. No nightmares. The amulet around her neck. Sora lay hugging the children. Yuna-Se didn't. She never slept for more than 3 hours. She stood by the sacred stone and spoke with her mother, or with the moons, or with herself. Daniel closed his eyes. Whoever was coming from the north, whoever they were, he had 2 years, 2 winters, and 53 women with stone spears and 3 bows, and a field that had not yet yielded a harvest, and a wall that was not yet finished, and knowledge that had not yet been passed on. He rolled onto his side. He pressed the obsidian to his chest, and he said quietly in Korean, "I'll make it in time." He wasn't sure, but he said it, because his grandfather had taught him that if you say it out loud, you start to believe it. And if you believe it, you act on it. And if you act on it, maybe you'll succeed. The fourth moon brought heat, dry and oppressive. The air shimmered over the field. The earth cracked without water. Daniel organized the watering. A chain of 10 women passed pots of water from the river to the field, pot by pot, from dawn until noon, every day. The spelt was forming ears. The grains were filling out. 2 more weeks, maybe 3. The peas were already producing pods, small, tough, but they were peas. The onions had grown leaves as thick as a finger. The turnips sat in the ground, gaining weight. Daniel pulled one out to check, the size of a fist, white, starchy. He boiled it in a pot and gave some to Halmo to try. The old woman chewed slowly, for a long time. Then she looked at him and said 2 words, then one more. Daniel pulled up a second turnip and boiled it for her. Halmo ate it and left. An hour later, Daniel saw her by the sacred stone. She was smearing the stone with and singing, louder than usual. Then she turned to the women who had gathered around and said that Mother Moon was pleased. The earth had given birth. It was a blessing. Daniel stood aside and said nothing. He understood what had happened. Halmo had accepted him. Not him personally, his achievement. The field that had yielded food was proof stronger than any words. Halmo was a priestess, but she was first and foremost an old woman who had watched children die of hunger for 20 years. Now the children were eating turnips, and peas, and bread, and fish. Theology takes a back seat when children stop crying from hunger. The wall grew, slowly, section by section. A mud brick wall in a semicircle from rock to rock. Ka-Yeon worked on the wall more than anyone else. She carried the mud and pounded it down with such force that the formwork creaked. Daniel reinforced the formwork with double stakes. The wall rose to chest height, then to shoulder height. On the most critical sections, it reached head height. Behind the wall was a moat. Stakes stood in the moat. In front of the moat was a strip of cleared ground 20 paces wide. Not a bush, not a tree, nothing to hide behind. Anyone who approached would be in plain sight. Tae-Ri checked. She stood behind the wall. She drew her bow. The arrow flew across the moat and lodged in a tree at the edge of the cleared strip. 40 paces, killing range. She nodded, not at Daniel, but to herself. She gave her approval. Daniel made 4 more bows. That made 5 in total. Tae-Ri selected the 4 best archers and began training them. Every day, from dawn. 5 women with bows on the wall. 5 archers who could stop 20 warriors on the open strip. Maybe, if they were lucky. Daniel watched the training and did the math. 5 bows, 30 arrows. Each bow can fire an arrow once every 10 heartbeats. If the enemy across the cleared strip 20 paces wide, they'll be on it in 5 heartbeats. The 5 archers will have time to fire once each. 5 arrows against the first wave. Then the moat, the stakes, the wall, the spears. He did the math and realized it wasn't enough. They might be able to stop 20 warriors, certainly not 100, but 20 was a start. It was during those very days that Daniel began working on something new. He found a different kind of clay by the river. Reddish, rich, heavy. He molded it into balls the size of a fist, dried them in the sun, fired them in the kiln. The result was rock-hard clay projectiles. He showed one to Yuna-Se. She held it in her hand. It was heavy. Then he demonstrated what to do with it. He took a strip of leather, 2 cords made of nettle rope, a sling, the simplest of weapons, as ancient as humanity itself. He placed the projectile inside. He spun it around. He released 1 cord. The projectile whizzed off and struck a tree 30 paces away. The bark flew off. The dent was as deep as a finger. Yuna-Se looked at the tree, then at the sling, then at Daniel. A sling didn't require the skill of an archer. A sling required only strength and coordination, and the women of the Gray Moon had strength to spare. In 3 days, Daniel made 20 slings and 100 clay projectiles. A week later, 15 women could hit the tree from 20 paces. After 2 weeks, from 30 paces. It wasn't a precise weapon, but a hail of 20 heavy projectiles aimed at a group of charging warriors could break the attack. It could maim, it could kill. Halmo officially declared the slings stones of the Mother Moon. Daniel hadn't asked her to. She did it on her own. She came to the training session. She watched. She picked up a projectile. She turned it over in her hands. She drew a symbol on it with ochre, a circle with a dot in the center, the moon. And she said that the stones had been sent by Mother Moon to protect her daughters. The women murmured in approval. A weapon blessed by a priestess was not just a weapon. It was sacred. And sacred weapons strike harder, because faith stands behind them. Daniel watched in silence and thought that Halmo hadn't just accepted him. She had begun to use him. His inventions were becoming her miracles. His knowledge was becoming her prophecies. And that was right. It was exactly what was needed. May Mother Moon bless them. May Halmo guide the faith. And he would do the things that faith blesses. Symbiosis. Just like in Malawi. Just like everywhere else he had worked. The local authority in front, the outsider behind. The result was shared. The harvest came at the end of the 4th moon. The spelt had ripened. The ears of grain had turned yellow and were bending heavily toward the ground. Daniel announced the harvest. Everyone who was able to work went out into the field. They cut the ears of grain with stone sickles that Daniel had made a week earlier. Curved stone blades set into wooden handles. Rough, clumsy, but they cut. The women worked in a row, silently, intently. Mi-Rae scurried among them, gathering the fallen ears of grain and stacking them into pots. By evening, the field had been harvested. Daniel spread the ears of grain out on animal hides by the stoves to dry. 2 days later, he threshed them, beating the ears with a stick on a flat stone. The grain rained down like fine rain, golden, warm. He gathered it all into pots. He counted it, 8 large pots. It wasn't much by the standards of his former world. It was little, but it was more than nothing. It was more than 1, 2, a lot. It was 8 pots of grain that could be ground into flour and baked into bread. He stood over the pots and his hands were trembling, not from fatigue, from realization. He had done it. The field had yielded a harvest. In a world where food was only killed or found, he had grown it from the ground. Bread. Real bread. Not that first, misshapen, sour flatbread made from a handful of old seeds. Bread made from his own grain. Daniel ground the spelt between the millstones. It was hard work. His hands went numb from turning the upper stone. Ka-Yeon saw this and pushed him aside with her shoulder. Her hands turned the millstone easily and smoothly. The flour poured out in a thin white stream. Not white, gray, with bran, coarse, but flour nonetheless. Daniel kneaded the dough. Water, flour, a pinch of salt from the quinoa. He let it rise by the warm stove. The dough rose only slightly. There was no yeast. But he knew how to make sourdough starter. He mixed the flour with water and left it in a warm place for 2 days. Wild yeast from the air did the work. The starter became bubbly. It smelled sour and sharp. He kneaded a new batch of dough using the sourdough starter. He let it rise. 3 hours. The dough doubled in size. He shaped it into a loaf, round, large, the size of a child's head. He placed it in the oven on the red-hot stones. The aroma filled the air 10 minutes later, an aroma that made Daniel's throat tighten. The smell of bread, real bread, baked grain and sourdough. A scent he remembered from his childhood, from his grandfather's kitchen, from a life that was no longer there. He sat by the oven and listened to the bread crackling inside. The women approached one after another. They stood there. They sniffed the air. They didn't understand what it was. None of them had ever smelled it before. 40 minutes later, Daniel pulled the loaf out, black, round, with a crack on top from which steam was rising. He placed it on the stone. The bread lay there, steaming and smelling so strong that the whole tribe stood around it in silence. Daniel broke the loaf. He divided it into pieces, a piece for each woman, a piece for each child. Halmo received the first piece. She chewed with her eyes closed for a long time. Then she opened her eyes and they were wet. She didn't say anything. She just chewed and cried. Mi-Rae took a bite and froze. Then she took another bite. Then she pressed the piece to her chest and said something quickly and happily. Daniel couldn't make out the words, but he caught the tone. It was more. Ka-Yeon ate in silence, as always, but she chewed slowly. Daniel saw her close her eyes for a second. Sora broke her piece in half and gave it to the children. In-ho shoved the whole piece of bread into his mouth and chewed, puffing out his cheeks. His little sister licked the crust. Tae-Ri took a piece. She looked at him. She sniffed it. She took a bite. She chewed without changing her expression. But Daniel noticed that she didn't throw it away. She didn't give it away. She ate it, down to the last crumb. Yuna-Se was the last to get her piece. She stood off to the side and watched the tribe eat. Then she walked over to Daniel, she took the bread, she took a bite, And that's when something happened that Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. She chewed, slowly, and an expression appeared on her face that he hadn't seen even once in 4 moons. Not pain, not calculation, not heaviness, something gentle. Something from the time when she was 7 years old and her mother was alive, and the world wasn't a place where people killed one another. She finished eating, she looked at Daniel, and she said nothing. No words were needed. She just stood there and looked. And for the first time in 4 moons, Daniel felt that it hadn't all been in vain. That this world with 2 moons and spears and death lurking behind every tree was worth it. Worth every callus and every sleepless night and every piece of raw meat he'd eaten when there was nothing else. Because Yuna-Se was eating bread, and the world was changing. They arrived at dawn on the 5th moon, 20 warriors of the Red Bull. Tae-Ri was the first to see them. She was on watch on the wall in the pre-dawn darkness and noticed movement at the edge of the forest. Shadows among the trees. Swift, crouching. She didn't shout, she whistled. A short, sharp whistle that meant enemy. The camp was up and ready within a minute. Daniel woke to the sound of running feet. He grabbed his obsidian blade. He bolted out of the hut. Yuna-Se was already standing by the wall with her spear. Ka-Yeon was nearby. 5 archers took up positions along the wall. 15 women with slings stood behind them. The rest were leading the children to the far end of the camp, toward the cliffs. Sora was carrying her daughter in her arms. Inho ran alongside her, clinging to the hem of her robe. Mi-Rae was standing on the wall next to Tae-Ri, and Daniel saw that she was holding a sling. Not a bow, a sling. She wasn't an archer, but she could throw a stone. 20 warriors emerged from the forest. Daniel saw them, and his stomach clenched. They were different. Not women with spears. Men. Large, broad-shouldered, clad in bear and wolf skins, their faces painted with red ochre. Each carried a heavy spear and a stone axe at his belt. They walked without hiding, confidently, like masters. They had come to finish off the remnants of a tribe that was supposed to have died out 3 years ago. They weren't expecting a wall. They weren't expecting a moat. They didn't expect bows. They expected a handful of half-dead women in ragged huts. The first warrior stepped out onto the cleared strip and stopped. He saw the wall. He saw the moat in front of it. He saw the stakes in the moat. He turned to the others and said something. Laughter. A short, vicious laugh. They didn't take it seriously. A wall of clay, a moat half their height, sticks stuck in the ground, against 20 warriors who had slaughtered entire tribes in a single night. They formed a line and moved forward. Quickly, not running, at a brisk pace. Spears forward. 20 steps. 15. 10. Tae-Ri fired first. The arrow struck the lead warrior in the shoulder. He flinched and fell to one knee. A second arrow. A third. A fourth. A fifth. 3 hit their mark. 2 warriors on the ground. One with a pierced thigh, the other with an arrow sticking out of his chest. He wasn't moving anymore. The remaining 17 screamed. A battle cry. Low and terrifying. And they ran. A hail of clay projectiles rained down on them when they were 5 steps from the moat. 20 slings. 20 heavy projectiles. 3 warriors fell. One had his head smashed in. The rest reached the moat. The first leaped and ran straight into a stake. A scream. High-pitched. Terrifying. The second circled around the stake and began scrambling up the moat wall. Tae-Ri shot him in the back from 3 paces away. He tumbled backward. The battle lasted less time than it takes to boil water. The Red Bull warriors weren't prepared for this. They were used to a different kind of war: charge, strike, kill, take. But here they were met by a wall, a moat, arrows, stones. They didn't know how to storm a wall. They didn't know how. In their world, there were no walls. 3 tried to flank it. Yuna-Se was waiting for them with 5 female warriors around the bend in the wall. A brief skirmish. 2 spears against 5. 3 warriors fell. The rest fled. 12 of the 20 warriors lay in the moat and on the cleared strip, dead or wounded. 8 fled toward the forest. Tae-Ri raised her bow. She looked at Yuna-Se. Yuna-Se shook her head. Let them run. Let them tell us. Tae-Ri lowered her bow. Not right away, but she lowered it. Daniel was standing behind the wall. He'd been standing there the whole time the battle raged. Not on the wall, not with a spear. Behind the wall, with a pot of water and strips of clean cloth. A first aid station. 3 women were wounded. One had her arm lacerated by a spear that had flown over the wall. Another had a bruise from a stone a warrior had hurled across the moat. The third had a burn from hot ashes she'd spilled in the commotion. Daniel bandaged them. He rinsed the wounds with boiled water. He applied honey to the wounds. Willow decoction for the pain. Clean cloth. His hands trembled, but he worked. His place was here. Not on the wall. Here. Yuna-Se approached him after the battle. Silently. She stood there. Daniel finished bandaging the wound. He looked up. Yuna-Se reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. A heavy palm. Warm. She held her hand there for 3 heartbeats. Then she withdrew it and left. Daniel understood. Thank you. The wall had saved him. The moat had saved him. The bows had saved him. He had saved himself. Not with his hands, with his mind, with his knowledge, with his habit of calculating, planning, and doing things that didn't exist in this world. That evening, Daniel sat by the hearth. The silence after the battle was heavy. The women weren't celebrating. They had seen the dead. For some, it was their first time killing. Their hands still remembered the impact of a spear piercing a body. Daniel knew this was only the beginning. 8 warriors had left. They would return to the Red Bull. They would tell him about the wall and the moat and the bows and the slings. And the Red Bull would come himself. Not with 20, with 100, maybe 200. Time was running out. Daniel took out a birch bark scroll and began to write. A list. Everything they needed to get done before the next attack. A higher wall, a deeper moat, more arrows, more cannonballs, more bows. A second row of stakes beyond the moat, traps in front of the cleared strip, pits with stakes covered with branches. He wrote, realizing that the list was longer than the time they had left, but he kept writing, because planning was the only weapon he knew how to use. The next morning, Halmo went out to the sacred stone. The whole tribe gathered. She sang, for a long time, loudly. Then she turned to the women and announced, the fire of Mother Moon has protected the daughters. The wall is the bones of Mother Moon. The moat is her palm, catching the enemies. The sling stones are her wrath. Mother Moon has awakened. Mother Moon is watching. Mother Moon will not allow it. The women listened, and Daniel saw their backs straighten. He saw their shoulders square, how their gaze changed. Not hope yet, but a premonition of hope, a faint shadow of a smile on faces that had known nothing but fear for 3 years. Halmo finished and turned to Daniel. She looked at him for a long time. Then she approached him. She placed her hand on his head, a small, dry palm, lighter than a bird's wing, a blessing. Daniel stood motionless, his throat tightened. The gesture was the same as when his grandfather had placed his hand on the top of his head when he was a child. A different world, different hands, the same gesture. Halmo withdrew her hand. She turned away. She was gone. Daniel stood there, blinking. Then he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and he went to build the wall. After the first battle, life sped up. Every day felt like a week. Daniel worked with a fury he hadn't known he possessed. The wall grew to twice his height in key sections. The moat grew deeper. Daniel added a second moat behind the first, a narrow one. He dug stakes into it at an angle. Anyone who jumped over the first moat would fall into the second. Traps. Pits in front of the cleared strip, covered with branches and leaves. There were sharpened stakes at the bottom. He dug 12 pits. He dug each one at night so that the enemy, if they were watching, wouldn't see where they were. Arrows. Daniel made 10 a day. Tae-Ri rejected 3 out of every 10. He learned from each one she rejected. By the end of the 5th moon, they had 120 arrows and 8 bows. Tae-Ri trained 7 archers, every day, without breaks. She was a strict teacher. She yelled. She hit their hands with a stick if their grip was wrong. She broke the arrows that flew crooked. But after 3 weeks, the 7 women could hit a log from 25 steps away. Not snipers, but good enough. The 5th moon brought 10 more refugees. 3 groups of 2, 3, and 5, from different tribes, all with the same story. Red Bull had come. The men were killed. The women were taken. Those who fled followed the smoke. The tribe was growing. 63 women, 18 children. Daniel took stock of their resources every 3 days. More people meant more hands. But more people also meant more mouths to feed. He planted a 3rd field, peas and turnips. He expanded the fishing nets in the river. The fishing was good. The smokehouse was in operation every day. The smoke from the smoked fish mingled with the smoke from the stoves. The camp smelled of life, of food, of warmth, of work. Sora had changed. Slowly, imperceptibly to those who weren't watching. But Daniel was watching. She began to speak, first with the children, then with the other refugee women, then with Yuna-Se. Quietly, carefully, like someone learning to walk after a long illness. She spoke about children, about how children should eat first, about how children shouldn't see dead enemies after a battle, about how children need to play. There was a strength in her voice that hadn't been there before. Not loudness, depth. She knew what she was talking about because she had had 5 children and had lost 3 of them. Yuna-Se listened. She nodded. Once she said that Sora would be in charge of the children in the tribe. Sora froze. She looked at Yuna-Se. Then she nodded. From that day on, the children of the Gray Moon had a protector. She set up a place for them to play, a flat area by the stream where the children could play with clay and sticks. She established a rule that after sunset, the children must sleep. They were not to sit by the fire, listening to the adults' conversations about war and death. They slept. Warm, safe. Inho stopped flinching at loud noises after 2 weeks. His little sister began to laugh. Quietly, hesitantly, but she laughed. Daniel began building a house for Sodai. Not a shack, a house. A small one, 4 walls made of mud brick, a roof of poles covered with bark and clay, a floor of packed earth, a stove in the corner, small, for a single room, a window made of thinly scraped birch bark that let in light, a bed made of poles and animal hides, low, a child's bed, just the right height for Inho. He worked on it for 3 weeks. In the evenings, after his main work was done, his hands wouldn't obey him from exhaustion. Ka-Yeon helped silently. She carried clay. She tamped down the walls. One evening she asked why. Why a separate house? Everyone lives together. Daniel thought about how to explain it. Then he said it in her language, which he now knew well enough, because she has no walls. Inside, everything is broken. She needs walls on the outside to fix the walls on the inside. Ka-Yeon was silent. Then she nodded. She continued tamping down the clay. When the house was ready, Daniel brought Soru over. She stood at the entrance and looked around. 4 walls, a roof, a door made of woven branches. The stove inside was already burning. Warm, dry, quiet. A bed in the corner with a soft fur rug. Small, for a boy and a girl. Daniel carved a lock out of wood, a simple bolt, a stick that fit into a bracket. He showed her how to lock the door from the inside. Then he handed her the bolt stick, and in broken Grey Moon language, he said the phrase he'd been preparing for 2 days. "This is yours, not shared. Yours. Here you can close the door and be alone." Sora stood there, holding the bolt. Just a stick, a piece of wood. But to her, it was a key. The first key in the history of this world. The right to a door she could lock. The right to a space where no one would enter without an invitation. She went inside. She closed the door. And Daniel heard a sound from behind the wall. A quiet one. But he'd heard that sound before. Many times. In Malawi, in Cambodia. The sound of a person who had finally allowed themselves to cry. He stood by the door for a minute. Then he left. Ka-Yeon stood to the side and looked at the house, then at Daniel, then back at the house. She didn't say anything, but Daniel noticed that her eyes were shining. The 6th moon was the bath moon. Daniel had been thinking about it for a long time, since the first week. The people in the tribe bathed in the river, cold, icy in the shadow of the rocks. They bathed rarely, once a week, or less often. In winter, they didn't bathe at all. Dirt, lice, skin diseases, sores that wouldn't heal because they weren't washed. Daniel knew that the bathhouse would change everything. Not immediately, but fundamentally. A clean body is a healthy body. Hot water means relaxed muscles. Steam means lungs that breathe. He found a spot, by a stream. He dug a pit, lined it with stones, walls of dense clay, a low roof to trap the steam. He placed large stones in the center. The stove was nearby. The stones were heated in the stove, then rolled into the pit. He splashed water on them. Steam. Hot. Thick. White. He tried the first bath himself. He climbed inside, splashed water on the stones. The steam burned his skin. Hot. Wet. Heavy. He sat there and breathed. His muscles relaxed. The back pain he'd been carrying since day 1 was gone. He climbed out half an hour later, red as a boiled crab. He was shaking. He sat down by the stream and doused himself with cold water. And he laughed. For the first time in 5 moons. He just laughed. Loudly. Silly. Because of the bathhouse. Because of the hot steam. Because his body remembered that it can be clean and warm and good. The women were suspicious of the bathhouse. Hot steam rising from the pit, stones that hissed, white mist. Halmo said it was like the breath of an underground spirit. Daniel invited her in first. She refused. He invited Yuna-Se. She looked at the pit, at the steam, at Daniel's face, red from the heat, and she stepped inside. She came out 20 minutes later, silently. Her face was relaxed. Her shoulders were slumped. For the first time, they weren't tense like a bowstring. She looked at Halmo and said 2 words, "Go in there." Halmo went in. She came out 10 minutes later. She stood by the stream and blinked. Then she sat down on a rock. Then she stood up. Then she sat down again. Then she said her back didn't hurt. Daniel had been expecting this. He knew that the hot steam and warmth would loosen her muscles, which had been stiff with pain for 20 years. He walked over. He showed her an exercise, a simple one, bending forward, bending backward, twisting, slowly, carefully. She did them. She winced, but she did them. After a week of daily baths and exercises, Halmo straightened up. Not completely, but noticeably. She walked straighter, more easily. The stick she'd leaned on for 20 years became a support rather than a crutch. She didn't say thank you. She did more than that. She declared the bath to be the warm breath of Mother Moon and decreed that every woman in the tribe must go once every 3 days. It became a ritual, a sacred. The bathhouse won everyone over, once and for all. The first group of 10 warrior women entered, and 5 minutes later, sounds rang out that Daniel had never heard in this camp before. Squeals. Not cries of fear, squeals of pleasure, laughter, splashing. 10 stern women with spears and scars were splashing water on each other and squealing like little girls. Daniel sat by the stream outside and smiled. They didn't come out for 4 hours. When they emerged, their faces were different, softer, younger, as if the hot steam had washed away not only the dirt, but also some of the pain they'd been carrying for 3 years. Tae-Ri came out last. Wet hair, red skin, the scar across her eyebrow seemed smaller. She walked past Daniel and stopped. She looked at him. He was waiting. She opened her mouth, closed it. Then she said one word. Okay. And she walked away. Daniel watched her go and thought that this one word was longer than any speech. The 7th moon was the first winter. The cold came overnight. In the morning, the ground was white. Frost lay on the walls, the roofs, and the stalks of the harvested field. The air burned his lungs. Daniel stood by the stove and counted. Grain reserves, dried meat, smoked fish, salted root vegetables, sauerkraut. He had started the sauerkraut at the beginning of the 6th moon. He'd found wild cabbage by the marsh, small, tough, but cabbage nonetheless. He chopped it up, salted it, packed it into large pots under a weight. 3 weeks later, the cabbage had fermented. The smell was familiar, sour and sharp. Not kimchi, of course. There was no pepper in this world. But sauerkraut is vitamin C. It's protection against scurvy. It's food that lasts all winter. He fermented 10 pots. That will be enough. It should be enough for 67 women and 21 children. The tribe had grown even larger. 4 new female refugees arrived at the end of the 6th moon. With them were 2 boys, the first boys in the tribe. Little ones, 3-year-olds. Their mothers had hidden them in the forest for 3 moons, feeding them whatever they could. When they heard about a place where they feed you and don't beat you, they came. Yuna-Se accepted them without a word. The boys are the future, a different future, one in which men don't kill, but build. Winter really set in a week later. Snow, thick, heavy. It blocked the trails. It filled in the moat. It settled on the walls and roofs. The temperature dropped so low that the water in the pots froze overnight. Daniel knew the winter would be harsh. 7 moons. That's what Yuna-Se said. 7 moons of cold. He had been preparing for 4 moons. The stoves were stoked. Firewood was stockpiled. Piles of kindling stood taller than the walls. The mud brick houses held in the heat. By this time, there were no longer any tents in the camp. 12 mud brick houses. Small, cramped, but with roofs, with walls, with a stove. Each house held 4 or 6 people. Daniel and Ka-Yeon had built them over the past 2 moons. Ka-Yeon built faster than he did, more precisely. Her walls were straighter. Her roofs didn't leak. She had a feel for clay and stone, just as Tae-Ri had a feel for a bowstring. They spent the first week of winter indoors. The stoves burned day and night. The women sat in the houses and wove. Nettle cloth, clothing, not pelts, fabric. Daniel showed them how to sew the simplest tunic. 2 pieces of fabric sewn together at the sides, with sleeves and a belt. Rough, simple, but warmer than a single pelt. And if you wore the fabric under the pelt, it was twice as warm. By the middle of winter, every woman had a set: a hide on top, fabric underneath, wraps on her legs, leather shoes stuffed with dry grass. Not boots, bags with drawstrings, but better than walking barefoot in the snow. Daniel made soap, fat from a reindeer carcass, lye from quinoa ash. He mixed them together, simmered the mixture over low heat, stirred it with a stick for 4 hours. A thick mass settled at the bottom of the pot. He poured off the excess liquid, poured the mass into clay molds. 3 days later, the mass had hardened. Soap. Yellow, smelly, rough. But it washed. It washed away the dirt. It lathered. The first lather in the history of this world. Mi-Rae saw the lather and froze. She touched it, rubbed it between her fingers, sniffed it. She burst out laughing. She ran to show the others. An hour later, the whole camp was washing up. The women lathered their hands and faces and laughed. Tae-Ri washed her hands and watched as the dirt washed away with the foam. She watched for a long time, as if the dirt were carrying away more than just dirt. Halmo sniffed the soap. She wrinkled her nose, but she washed her hands, and she nodded. The soap, too, had become a gift from Mother Moon. Daniel was no longer surprised. By midwinter, Daniel realized that everyone was alive. Everyone. 67 women, 21 children. Not a single death. Not from hunger, not from the cold, not from illness. The children ate every day. Hot meals, bread and fish and spelt porridge and sauerkraut. They drank boiled water. They slept in warm houses. They washed with soap. They wore clothes under their furs. The cough that had plagued the camp 5 moons ago was gone. The sores on their hands had healed. The children had gained weight. Mi-Rae had grown half a head taller. In-ho no longer looked like an old man. He began to look like a boy. Daniel stood in the middle of the camp on a frosty day and counted the people. Everyone is here. Everyone is alive. Everyone. He remembered what Yuna-Se had said when they met. For the first time in 20 years, no one had died that winter. 20 years. Every winter someone had died. An old person, a sick person, a frail child. Every winter, 20 years. And now, for the first time, everyone had lived to see spring. Daniel stood there, his eyes wet. Not from the cold. It was that very winter that he decided to hold a celebration. New Year's. He chose the night of the shortest day, the middle of winter. He baked a cake for 3 days. Flour, honey, nuts, dried berries, everything he had. The cake turned out huge, round, dark, with a shiny honey crust. He hung pine cones and pieces of fabric dyed with ochre on the tree, red and yellow. The tree stood in the center of the camp and looked like nothing the women had ever seen before. Then he made gifts for each of them, personally, one by one. For Yuna-Se, a bone comb with a moon carved into it. For Tae-Ri, a leather arm guard. For Halmo, warm fur-lined slippers. For Mi-Rae, a wooden bird-shaped whistle. For Ka-Yeon, a small hammer with her name carved on the handle. In Hangul. She couldn't read yet, but the name was hers. For Sori, a rag doll for her youngest daughter, with a face drawn in charcoal and hair made of nettle thread. That evening, he gathered everyone around the large stove. The Christmas tree stood nearby. The pie lay on a stone. Daniel began to speak, slowly, in the language of the gray moon, which he now knew well enough. He said that in his world, there is a day when people celebrate having survived the longest night. That after this night, the light returns. The days grow longer. Warmth draws nearer. Winter isn't eternal. And on this day, people give each other late, not because they have to, because they want to. Because every person deserves to know that someone thought of them, that someone made something for them with their own hands, that they aren't just one of many, but them, a specific person, one of a kind. He handed out the gifts, a small item to each woman, a toy to each child, 67 gifts and 21, 88 items. He'd been making them every night for the past 3 weeks. He slept only 2 hours a night. His fingers were cut and blistered. The silence was complete. They didn't understand. A gift. Something given to you just because. Not for food, not for work, not for your body. Just because you exist. There was no such thing in their world. There was no such word in their language. Halmo looked at the slippers. Soft, warm, just right for her foot, for her small, crooked foot. She touched the fur. Then she put them on. Then she sat down and stayed there. Mi-Rae blew into the whistle. The sound was high and clear, like a bird. She blew again. She laughed. She ran off to show them. Ka-Yeon picked up the hammer. She looked at the handle, at the letters she didn't recognize. She showed them to Daniel and asked what they were. He said, "Ka-Yeon, that's your name." She stared at the letters, traced them with her finger. Then she pressed the hammer to her chest, silently. Sora gave her daughter a doll. The girl grabbed it with both hands and held it close to her. She didn't let go until morning. Tae-Ri picked up the gauntlet. She examined it. She ran her finger along the seam. She felt the leather's finish. She slipped it onto her wrist. She adjusted it. It fit her hand perfectly. She looked at Daniel for a long time. And suddenly her eyes filled with tears. She turned away quickly. She walked off into the darkness. But Daniel saw it. Yuna-Se was the last to pick up the comb. She turned it over in her hands. She saw the moon at the tip. Delicate, carved from bone. A crescent moon. She ran her finger over it. Then she tucked the comb into her hair. It stayed in place. She turned toward Daniel, and for a single second, for just one single second, the corner of her mouth turned up. Not a smile, the shadow of a smile, a ghost. But Daniel saw it, and his heart stopped. They ate pie. They drank hot tea made from dried berries. They sat by the stove. The children played with their toys. Mi-Rae whistled on a whistle, and everyone grimaced and laughed. Halmo sat in warm slippers, and for the first time in 20 years, her back didn't hurt. Her feet were warm, and she was surrounded by lively children eating pie. She cried, quietly, soundlessly. Tears rolled down her wrinkles and dripped onto the fur. Daniel sat off to the side. He watched them, his tribe, 88 people eating pie in the middle of winter. And he missed his mom, and his grandpa, and the phone with their photo on it, and the world where there were forks and coffee and hot showers. But he could miss them later. Right now, there were them, and the pie, and the Christmas tree with pine cones, and 2 moons in the sky, and the silence inside, which was not emptiness, but fullness. Spring of the second year came with mud and meltwater and hope. The snow was melting away. The earth was baring itself. Black, rich, ready. Daniel stood at the edge of the field and planned the planting. 3 fields from last year, 2 new ones, more acreage, more crops. Peas, spelt, turnips, onions, wild barley that Mi-Rae found in a distant clearing beyond the river. Barley means porridge. Porridge means a winter without hunger. He planted 5 fields in 2 weeks. 20 women worked on the planting. Yuna-Se organized the shifts. Morning. Afternoon. A system that hadn't existed before. A system she devised herself using notched sticks. Daniel taught her numbers. She taught him how to lead. It was that very spring that Daniel found what he'd been looking for since day one: bog ore. He was walking along the stream behind the camp, looking for clay for new pots, when he saw reddish lumps at the bottom of the stream. Heavy, porous. Reddish from iron oxide. Limonite. Bog ore. The simplest iron ore in the world. The kind that the first blacksmiths in human history smelted. Daniel picked up a lump. His hands were shaking. He was holding iron in his palm. Not pure, not metal, ore. But this ore could be turned into metal. Iron. A knife that never dulls. A hoe that cuts through the earth like butter. An axe. An arrowhead. He stood knee-deep in the stream with a reddish lump in his hand, and his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He told Ka-Yeon, only her, just her, for now. Because if iron could be smelted from this ore, then a blacksmith was needed. And Ka-Yeon was already a blacksmith. She didn't know it yet. But Daniel knew. He'd seen her work with stone, with clay, with wood, precisely, patiently, strongly. Hands made for forging, eyes for the shape, patience for the heat. He led her to the stream, showed her the ore. She picked up a lump, turned it over, sniffed it, looked at him questioningly. Just a rock. Daniel took the ore. He placed it in a pot, surrounded it with charcoal, piled more charcoal on top, put it in the furnace, the hottest one. He fanned the fire through a clay tube. There were no bellows. He blew through the tube with his mouth for 2 hours. His lungs were burning. His head was spinning. Ka-Yeon took over for him. She blew for another hour. The heat in the furnace turned white, unbearable. After 4 hours, Daniel pulled the pot out. He smashed it. Inside lay a lump, black, porous, shapeless. He placed it on a flat stone. He picked up another stone. He struck it. The lump flattened. It didn't split. It flattened. Metal. Dirty. Brittle. Full of slag, but metal. Iron. Ka-Yeon looked at the flattened lump, then at Daniel, then back at the lump. She reached out and touched it. It was still warm, hard. Not a stone, something else. Something that didn't exist in this world. The first smelting attempt was a failure. The iron was full of bubbles and cracks. The second wasn't any better. Neither was the third. Daniel recalled everything he'd read about primitive metallurgy. He needed bellows for a steady flow of air. He needed a higher temperature. He needed more coal. He needed flux. He made bellows out of animal hide and 2 wooden planks, rough, crooked, but they pumped air into the furnace through a clay tube. Ka-Yeon pumped the bellows. Her hands never grew tired. The fourth smelting yielded a piece of iron the size of a fist, solid, heavy, with a minimum of slag. Daniel placed it on the stone anvil. He picked up a stone hammer. He heated the iron in the furnace until it glowed red. He pulled it out. He struck it. The metal rang out. Ka-Yeon stood nearby, listening to that sound, a sound the world of Arkhai had never heard before, the clang of iron against stone. Daniel struck it and pulled out a strip, crooked, thick, uneven, back into the furnace. He heated it again. He struck it again. The strip stretched out. It became thinner, smoother. He bent the edge. He fitted it onto a wooden handle. A hoe. The first iron hoe in the history of this world. Crooked, rough, awful, but made of iron. He went out into the field. He thrust the hoe into the ground. The earth gave way easily, like butter. A stone hoe would go in a finger's depth. An iron one, a palm's depth. He drew a furrow, straight, deep, in 10 heartbeats. With a stone hoe, that furrow would have taken 100 heartbeats. Yuna-Se stood at the edge of the field and watched. She saw the furrow. She saw the speed. She saw how the earth yielded to the new tool. She walked over. She took the hoe, heavier than the stone one, but easier to use in the ground. She dug her own furrow, then another. Then she lifted the hoe and looked at the dull gray metal, the jagged edge, the rough handle. And Daniel saw in her eyes something he hadn't seen before. Not gratitude, not surprise, understanding. She understood what it meant. Land that could be tilled 10 times faster meant a field 10 times larger. A field 10 times larger meant 10 times more grain. 10 times more grain meant 10 times more people. She stood there with the hoe in her hands and saw the future. And at last, a word for it appeared in her language. Daniel taught Ka-Yeon how to forge every day. Ore, coal, the furnace, bellows, the anvil, a blow, heating, a blow. She picked it up faster than he expected. Her hands sensed the metal just as they sensed clay. She knew when the iron was hot and malleable. She knew when it cooled and became brittle. She knew when to strike hard and when to strike gently. After 2 weeks, she made her first knife, a small one, with a bone handle. The blade was uneven but sharp, 10 times sharper than any stone knife. She held it up to the light and turned it over in her hands. The metal glinted, dull and gray, but it glinted nonetheless. She turned to Daniel, and he saw an expression on her face that he'd only seen before when she was sitting at the potter's wheel. Serenity. She was back to her element. Stone, clay, iron. Her hands were made for this. Daniel looked at her and said the words he'd been preparing for a long time, in the language of the gray moon. In my world, the best blacksmiths are people with hands like yours. You're not broken. You're rare. Ka-Yeon looked at him for a long time, then at her own hands. Large, broad, hands that people looked down on. Hands that weren't the hands of a beautiful girl in this world. Hands because of which she was told that no one would take her. She looked at the knife in those hands, and her chin lifted by a centimeter, by a millimeter. But Daniel saw it. By the end of spring in the second year, the tribe had 90 women and 26 children. 3 new families had arrived over the winter. An alliance with 2 neighboring tribes had been forged through trade. Daniel had invented trade, not money, barter, but organized, systematic. The Gray Moon tribe provided salt, cloth, pots, iron knives. In exchange, it received hides, dried meat, flint for arrowheads, information, intelligence. The 2 neighboring tribes were small, 30 and 40 people, respectively. Weak. But they knew the territory. They knew the trails. They knew where the Red Bull roamed. They became the eyes and ears of Gray Moon. And for that, they received knives, salt, and pots. And one day, Daniel would send a teacher to them, a woman from Gray Moon who would show them how to build a furnace and sow a field. But that would come later. Now it was spring. The fields are sown. The ore is smelted. Ka-Yeon forges. Tae-Ri shoots. Yuna-Se counts and plans. Mi-Rae runs and laughs and learns new words. Halmo blesses and stands up straight, and her back doesn't hurt. So-Ra teaches the children, and her eyes are no longer empty. Daniel stands on the wall and looks toward the south. From somewhere over there, the Red Bull will come. Not 20 warriors, 100, maybe more. He will come because the smoke from 5 hearths is visible a day's journey away, because iron clangs and that sound echoes through the forest, because the trade trails lead to the Gray Moon, and every trail is a thread that can be traced. He will come. Daniel knew it, and he was preparing. The summer of the second year was hot and unsettling. Scouts from allied tribes brought news every 3 days. Red Bull was gathering his forces. Gark Tush had united 2 small clans under his command. His army had grown, not 300 as before, more. The scouts reported different numbers. Some had seen 400, others 500. Daniel took the average, 400 warriors, against 100 combat-ready women of the Gray Moon. 4-1. Poor odds, even behind the wall. He didn't sleep. He planned. He drew defensive diagrams on birch bark. He erased them. He redrew them. The wall was strong, but not endless. The moat was deep, but not impassable. There were 200 arrows, 300 sling stones, 40 iron arrowheads. Ka-Yeon forged day and night. Sparks flew from the anvil like malevolent fireflies. She made arrowheads, knives, spearheads. An iron arrowhead could pierce skin from 30 paces away. A stone one couldn't even from 10. The difference between life and death. Daniel was thinking about something else. About how defense wouldn't win this war. You could repel 1 attack, 2, 3, but the Red Bull would keep coming back again and again. He had more people, more food, more territory. He could afford to lose warriors. The Gray Moon could not. Every woman killed was a loss that could never be replaced. A different solution was needed. Not defense, offense. The thought was terrifying. Daniel had never planned for war. He planned crops and logistics and construction. But war had come to him, and he had to respond. He went to Yuna-Se. They sat on the wall at night. 2 moons hung over the forest, a large yellow one and a small blue one. Daniel spoke slowly, in the language of the Gray Moon, which he now spoke fluently. He said they couldn't wait, that if the Red Bull came with 400 men, the wall wouldn't hold, that they had to go to him. Yuna-Se was silent for a long time. Then she asked one thing. How? Daniel took out a piece of birch bark. He unfolded it. On it was a map. The first map in the history of Arkhai. The location of the Red Bull's camp, according to the female scouts. Trails, rivers, forests, distances in days' journey. He ran his finger across the birch bark and spoke. The Red Bull is strong on the battlefield, in open combat. They're used to attacking head-on, raiding camps, slaughtering the sleeping. But they don't know what kind of ambush. They don't know what an organized formation is. They don't know what archers in cover are. They don't know what a night march is. Yuna-Se listened. Her eyes moved across the map. She was taking it all in. Daniel could see a plan taking shape in her mind. Not his plan, her plan. She was a warrior. He wasn't. He gave her the tools. She decided how to use them. Yuna-Se said she would go alone, at the head of the force. Daniel nodded. He knew it couldn't be any other way. She was the elder. She was the leader. And she was the daughter of the man Gark Tush had killed with his own hands. This wasn't just a military decision. It was blood for blood, a law that had existed here long before Daniel and would continue to exist after him. The preparations took 2 moons, summer and early fall. Daniel worked like a man possessed. 200 iron arrowheads, P50 iron spearheads, 20 long spears of a new type, ashwood shafts, iron tips, a third longer than a standard spear. A formation of 10 women armed with such spears could halt a cavalry charge. There were no horses in this world, but the principle was the same. A wall of spears that could not be breached head-on. Tae-Ri trained 20 female archers every day until dark. Volley fire, On command. 1. Everyone shoots. 2. Everyone draws a new arrow. 3. Everyone shoots. In unison. 20 arrows in the air at once. A hail of arrows. A wall. Death. Tae-Ri was a strict commander. She would strike their hands with a stick for missing a shot. She forced them to shoot in the rain, in the dark, with tired hands. The 20 archers became a machine, not individual shooters, a single weapon. Yuna-Se divided the army into 3 parts. The first group, 50 female warriors with spears and slings, the main force. The second group, Tae-Ri's 20 archers, the ambush. The third group, 30 women, the reserve and camp defense. Sora led the reserve. Daniel was surprised. Sora wasn't a warrior, but Yuna-Se explained. Sora protects the children. If the army is defeated, Sora will lead the children and the elderly into the mountains. She will survive. She knows how to survive. She has survived before. Daniel looked at Sora. She stood tall. Her eyes were calm. Her hands didn't tremble. She nodded. She knew what to do. Daniel stayed behind at the camp. His place was here, the infirmary, the kitchen, the wall. He couldn't go with them. He would be a liability in battle, slow, weak, clumsy with a weapon. His hands were meant for something else, for bread and ovens and pots and bandages, not for spears. Yuna-Se knew this. He knew this. But as the army marched off at dawn on that autumn day, Daniel stood on the wall and watched as 100 women with spears and bows disappeared into the forest. And his hands were clenched into fists so tightly that his fingernails dug into his palms. Mi-Rae stood beside him, quiet, serious. She hadn't gone with the army. Yuna-Se had forbidden it. Too young. Mi-Rae had argued. She'd screamed. She'd cried. Then she fell silent and climbed onto the wall next to Daniel. And she stood there until the last figure had vanished among the trees. 3 days of silence. Daniel paced around the camp, unable to settle down. He checked the supplies: bandages, willow decoction, honey for wounds, and hot water in pots. Everything was ready. It had been ready yesterday and the day before. He kept checking because he couldn't stop himself. Sode ran the camp, quietly, calmly. She assigned tasks. She watched over the children. She organized guard duty on the wall. 30 women with spears and slings, the elders, those who couldn't go on the expedition, but who could stand behind the wall and hurl stones. Daniel looked at Sode and saw a person he hadn't seen a year ago. Back then, she had been lying in a hut, staring into space. Now she stood in the courtyard and gave orders. Her voice was soft, but people listened to her, because behind her voice lay knowledge, the knowledge of what loss is, and the knowledge that it is possible to survive. On the 4th day, a scout ran up, a young girl from an allied tribe. She had been running all night. Gasping for breath, she said one thing: there had been a battle. Daniel grabbed her by the shoulders. Then he let go. Then he asked, "Who won?" The girl shook her head. She didn't know. She'd seen smoke. She saw bodies. She ran away. Daniel stood there, his heart pounding in his throat. He didn't know. He hadn't known for 2 days. On the 6th day, figures appeared at the edge of the forest, many of them. Daniel stood on the wall and counted: 10, 20, 30. They were moving slowly. Some leaned on spears. Some were being carried. Daniel strained his eyes. A tall figure with a heavy scythe led the way. Yuna-Se. She was alive. He exhaled, and his knees went weak. He grabbed the wall to keep from falling. Yuna-Se was alive. The army had returned. 73 women out of 100. 7 killed. 20 wounded. Of the 20, 6 were seriously wounded. Daniel worked without stopping. He washed the wounds, he bandaged them, he applied honey, he gave them willow decoction to drink, he stitched the lacerated skin with nettle thread and a bone needle. His hands were covered in blood up to his elbows. Ka-Yeon was among the wounded. A cut on her forearm from an enemy's axe, deep, down to the bone. Daniel washed the wound with boiled water. Ka-Yeon didn't flinch. She silently clenched her teeth and looked away. He applied honey. He bandaged it with a clean cloth, tightly. She nodded. She stood up. She walked toward the forge. Daniel called out to her. She turned around. He told her to rest. She looked at him, at her bandaged arm. Then she kept walking, toward the forge. An hour later, he heard the clang of the hammer on the anvil. Ka-Yeon was forging with one hand. Tae-Ri was unharmed, not a scratch. She returned with an empty quiver and someone else's blood on her face. Her 20 archers had lost 2 of their own. The ambush had worked. They had taken up positions on the hillside above the trail the Red Bull was taking to the battlefield. When the Garktush warriors fled from Yuna-Se's spears, they ran straight into the arrows. 3 volleys, 60 arrows, 37 hits. Tae-Ri reported to Yuna-Se briefly and matter-of-factly. Numbers, facts, no emotion. But as she walked past Daniel to her post, he noticed that her hands were trembling. Slightly, barely noticeable. She had killed people, not animals, people. And even though those people had dragged her mother away 3 years ago, even if they deserved to die, her hands were still trembling. Daniel didn't approach her, but that evening he placed a hot flatbread and a pot of herbal tea by her spot. In the morning, the pot was empty. The flatbread had been eaten. Yuna-Se told him that night, by the hearth, quietly. They found Red Bull on the 5th day of their march, a camp by the river, a large one, over 400 warriors. Yuna-Se didn't attack the camp. She lured them out. She sent 10 women to the edge of the camp at dawn. They lit fires. They threw stones from slings. And then they ran. Garktush flew into a rage. He sent 100 warriors in pursuit. They ran along the trail through the forest, straight into Tae-Ri's ambush. 3 volleys from the hill. A wall of spears at the end of the trail. 100 warriors became 60 in a minute. Panic. Flight. Yuna-Se did not pursue. She retreated. She regrouped. She waited. Garktush realized he had been tricked. He gathered the survivors, 300 of them, and set out himself. Yuna-Se met him in a clearing by a stream. Open battle. 50 spearwomen against 300 warriors. Madness. But their spears were longer. Their tips were made of iron. Their formation was tight. The women stood shoulder to shoulder, like a wall. Like the wall Daniel had taught them to build. Only this one was alive. Red Bull struck. The first wave crashed against the spears. The second. The third. Iron against stone. Discipline against fury. Organization against habit. Garktush threw everything he had at them. His personal guard. 30 of his best warriors. They broke through the formation in one spot. Yuna-Se was there. She faced Garktush head-on. He was 2 heads taller, twice as heavy. The stone axe in his hand could split a bull's skull. Yuna-Se struck with her spear. He parried it. He struck with the axe. She dodged. A second thrust with the spear. Into the thigh. Garktush fell to one knee. A third thrust. Into the throat. Garktush looked at her. His eyes weren't angry. They were surprised. He said something, quietly. Yuna-Se leaned in to hear. He said, "You've learned not to be afraid. This is the end for all of us." And he died. Yuna-Se stood over him. His blood flowed down onto her feet. She stood there in silence. And Daniel, listening to this story by the fireplace, could see from her face that she wasn't celebrating. She simply closed the door to the past. 3 years of fear, shame, and helplessness. She closed it and turned the lock, just like the lock Daniel had carved for Sodai. Only this lock was made of blood. After the fall of Garktush, the Red Bull collapsed. The warriors fled, some into the forest, some to the river. Yuna-Se did not pursue them. She did something else. She went to the Red Bull's camp. There were women there, 120 concubines from various tribes. They sat in pens like livestock. Yuna-Se opened the pens. She said one sentence. "You are free. Go wherever you wish. Whoever wants to come with us will be fed and clothed, and no one will ever strike you." 83 women followed her. 37 left to find their tribes. Yuna-Se didn't hold them back. The fall of the second year became the fall of construction. The tribe had doubled in size in a single moon. 170 women and 40 children. The camp in the rocks was small. Too small. Daniel had known this for a long time. He had chosen the site back in the spring. The confluence of two rivers, a half-day's journey to the south, a wide floodplain, gentle banks, a forest nearby, clay on the shore, stone in the hills, water on both sides, natural protection, a place for a city. Not a camp, not a village, a city. The move took 10 days. Daniel organized a caravan, pots, tools, grain, iron, leather bags, looms, everything they had created over the past year. The women carried it on their backs, on stretchers made of poles. Ka-Yeon carried an anvil, a 50-pound stone, all by herself, on her shoulders. 3 hours without stopping. Daniel offered to help. She looked at him. He withdrew his hands. Tae-Ri led the advance guard. 10 archers in front of the caravan, 10 on either side. A rear guard of 20 spearwomen, a military column. Organized, disciplined. A year ago, they had been starving women with stone clubs. Now, they were an army. The city was growing rapidly. Daniel sketched out a map, a central square, 4 streets radiating from it, houses on both sides. Every house made of clay and stone, roofs of poles and birch bark, a stove in each, windows of scraped birch bark, doors with locks, a wall around the city, stone, 2 men tall, with towers at the corners, a moat in front of the wall, oak gates with a bolt. The women built, every day, 170 pairs of hands. Ka-Yeon supervised the laying of the walls. She sensed the stone as if it were a living being. She knew which one to place first, which one on top, where mortar was needed, where the stone would hold on its own. The walls grew straight and strong. Daniel built houses, one after another. By the end of fall, 30 houses stood, small, cramped, but real, with roofs that didn't leak, with walls that held in the heat, with stoves that burned steadily and for a long time. In the center of the square, Halmo built a temple. Not Daniel, Halmo. She came to him with a drawing on birch bark, a round building with a conical roof, with a hearth in the center, with an opening in the roof for smoke. Smoke rising toward the mother moon. Daniel looked at the drawing, then at Halmo. Then he built the temple exactly as she had drawn it. Exactly, without any changes. It was her temple, her home. Halmo went inside when the temple was ready. She lit a fire in the hearth. She sang all day. By evening, she came out and announced that Mother Moon was pleased with her new home, that the city was blessed, that the children born here would be strong. She stood in front of the temple, upright, petite, 62 years old. For the first time in her life, she was the high priestess of a real temple, not an old woman with a cane standing by a weathered stone. She looked at Daniel. She nodded, briefly, dryly. But that nod said it all. The school was built next to the temple. Daniel insisted on it. The school and the temple side by side. Knowledge and faith. Not at odds with each other. Side by side. The school was simple. A long building with a roof. Benches made of logs. A wall of smooth clay on which one could write with charcoal. Daniel adapted Hangul to the sounds of the Gray Moon language. 24 letters. Each letter represents one sound, the simplest writing system he could devise in such a limited time. He wrote all the letters on the clay wall and began teaching. Mi-Rae was his first student. She devoured the letters eagerly, just as she devoured words. Within a week, she was reading simple words. Within 2 weeks, she was putting sentences together. Within a month, she was writing. In large, crooked letters, but she was writing. Water, fire, moon, house, mother, friend. She wrote her name on the school wall. Mi-Rae. She stood there and looked at it, traced it with her finger. Letters that represented her. Not a drawing, not a symbol. Her name. Written down. Permanent. One that would remain even if she were gone. Yuna-Se came to school in the evening, when no one was there. Daniel was sitting by the wall, preparing his homework for the next day. She sat down next to him, silently. Then she asked him to teach her how to write her name. Daniel took a piece of charcoal. He wrote on the clay. Yuna-Se. 3 syllables, 6 letters. She took the charcoal from his hand. Their fingers touched. She didn't pull her hand away. Neither did he. She wrote it, slowly, letter by letter. More crooked than Mi-Rae's, but she wrote it. Yuna-Se. She looked at her name for a long time, then at his hand, then at his face, and asked quietly, "Teach me how to laugh." Daniel didn't understand. She repeated it. She had forgotten how to laugh. 3 years ago, she had laughed for the last time, when her mother was still alive, when the tribe was whole. Then something inside her broke, and it stopped working. She couldn't laugh. She didn't know how. She tried. It didn't work. Daniel looked at her, at the woman who had killed Gark Tush in hand-to-hand combat, who had led an army through the forest, who had made decisions on which the lives of 200 people depended, and who couldn't laugh. He didn't know what to say. He told the truth. "I don't know how to teach someone to laugh, but I can tell a story." In his world, there was a man named Charlie. He walked funny. He had a little mustache. He twirled his cane. He fell down and got back up, fell down and got back up. And everyone laughed, not because he was funny, but because he got back up every time. Yuna-Se listened. He told her about Chaplin, as best he could, in the language of the Gray Moon. Then he demonstrated. He stood up. He walked across the school, shifting from one foot to the other. He twirled an imaginary cane. He tripped over a bench. He fell. He got up. He tripped again. Yuna-Se watched. Her face was stony. Daniel fell for the 3rd time, on purpose, silly. He stretched out on the floor and lay there, feigning bewilderment. And then, quietly, briefly, like the crack of ice on a river in spring, Yuna-Se laughed. 1 sound. 2. She covered her mouth with her hand, as if she were startled. Then she removed her hand, and laughed again, quietly, hesitantly, like someone learning to walk all over again. Daniel was lying on the school floor, looking up at her, and smiling, and his eyes were wet, and hers were too. The winter of the 2nd year was different, not survival, life. Stoves were burning in the city. Smoke rose from 30 chimneys. A wall stood all around, stone, sturdy. The gate was bolted shut. A moat lay before the wall. Guards stood in the towers. Inside the walls were 210 people, women, children, a few men from among the Red Bull's freed concubines, men whom Yuna-Se had accepted on the same terms as the women. Work, eat, don't hit anyone. be part of the community. 4 remained. Are timid, broken, former slaves. Daniel worked with them. He showed them. He taught them. He didn't give orders. One of them became Ka-Yeon's assistant in the forge, a quiet man named Han-So, a former captive from some distant tribe. His hands were large and deft. Ka-Yeon accepted him without a word. She showed him how to hold the hammer. He learned quickly. After a moon had passed, they were forging together, in silence, in unison, 2 hammers on a single anvil. Daniel was deciphering the obsidian. Every night, he took the black stone out of the pot that Ka-Yeon had made during the first moon. Glowing veins, hangul, a promise. But now he saw more. The veins were changing, slowly. At night, when the 2 moons were in a certain position, the light within the stone grew stronger and new lines appeared. Not letters, drawings, a map. Daniel turned the stone and saw the lines of rivers, settlements, and one large dot in the north, bright, pulsating. He showed the stone to Halmo. The old woman took it in her hands. She looked at it for a long time. She traced the veins with her fingers. Then she closed her eyes. She swayed. She muttered. She opened her eyes. And she said something Daniel hadn't expected. In her childhood legends, there was a line. The bearer of the promise will come, and the moon will laugh again. She knew. Not everything, but she knew that the stone was not just a stone, that Daniel was not just a stranger from nowhere, that the word promise on this stone had been his name long before he was born. Daniel listened and felt goosebumps run down his spine. Who was he? Why was he here? What had he promised? To whom? Halmo said the answers lay to the north, where the dot pulsed, where something had awakened. Daniel looked north, beyond the city walls, beyond the forest, beyond the mountains. Something was waiting for him there, something vast and ancient and perhaps terrifying. But that was later. First, he had to survive the winter, build a city, raise children, write a book, the first book in the history of Arkhai. Daniel wrote it all winter long, birch bark sheets sewn together with nettle thread, letters written in charcoal, small, neat. He wrote everything down, how to make fire, how to build a furnace, how to obtain salt, how to plow a field, how to sow grain, how to harvest the crop, how to grind flour, how to bake bread, how to make a potter's wheel, how to shape pots, how to tan leather, how to weave fabric, how to make soap, how to smelt iron, how to forge, how to boil water, how to bandage a wound, how to deliver a baby with clean hands, how to count, how to write. Every page was a set of instructions, simple, clear, with illustrations, a book of knowledge, a book of civilization, so that if he died tomorrow, the knowledge wouldn't die with him, so that Mi-Rae could read it and teach others, so that 100 years from now, someone would open this book and build a furnace. Not because Daniel showed them how, but because Daniel wrote it down. He wrote the last page on the night winter ended. He placed a piece of coal in the fire. He closed the book, tied it with a string, and wrote a single word on the cover. In hangul, a promise. Spring of the 3rd year, a year ahead of schedule. You must make it in time, before the 3rd winter. They're coming. Daniel stood on the tower and looked out at the city. His city. No, their city. 30 houses, a temple, a school, a blacksmith shop, a bakery, a bathhouse, a weaving workshop, a pottery workshop, a wall, a gate, a square with a well in the center, fields beyond the wall, turning green, sown, a road to the river, a pier for fishing boats. Yes, boats. Ka-Yeon built the first boat that winter from a hollowed-out log, rough, heavy, but it floated, and you could set nets from it. Fish fed the town just as much as the fields did. Daniel looked at all this and counted. 210 people, 10 allied tribes. Through trade, through teachers, through salt and knives and knowledge, Grey Moon became the center, a star around which others revolved. Small, weak, but together they were something Arkhai had never known. An alliance. Ka-Yeon came to him one spring evening, silently, as always. She held out something wrapped in cloth. Daniel unwrapped it. A knife. But not an ordinary one. A blade made of the finest iron she knew how to forge. Polished. Shining. A name was engraved on the blade. His name. In Hangul. Daniel. The handle was made of deer bone, wrapped in thin leather. It fit his hand. His hand. He picked up the knife, turned it over in his hand. Perfect balance. Perfect weight. An object made for a specific person. His own principle turned toward him. He looked at Ka-Yeon. She stood there, looking at her hands. Large, broad, calloused from the hammer, scorched from the forge. Hands that the whole world considered wrong. Hands with which she had forged the first knife, the first sword, and the first hoe in the history of Arkhai. She spoke softly. There is a custom in her tribe. When a woman wants to tell a man that he is hers, she forges a knife for him. It's an old custom, but she thought about it and decided that old customs are sometimes right. Daniel held the knife. He looked at her. She didn't look up. He took a step forward. He placed his hand on hers, a large hand, warm from the iron, and said, "Thank you," in Korean. She didn't know that word, but she understood. The summer of the 3rd year. 1,000 people lived in and around the city of the Grey Moon. Daniel stood on the main tower and counted the smoke. 50 furnaces, 5 cousins, 3 bakeries, 2 bathhouses. The smoke rose toward the sky and dissolved among the clouds. The city was alive. Not merely surviving, alive. In the square, children played a game Mi-Rae had invented. They ran between marks drawn on the ground and tossed a rag ball back and forth. Their voices rang out between the walls of the houses, ringing, joyful, a sound Daniel hadn't heard during his first year. Because the children were silent. Hungry children don't play. They conserve their strength. These children were well fed. And they shouted and laughed and fought over the ball, and it was the most beautiful sound Daniel had ever heard in either world. The first wheel appeared at the beginning of summer. Daniel had been thinking about it for 2 years. A round disc made of thick planks fastened together with crossbars, an ash wood axle, a frame made of poles, a crude cart, creaky, crooked, but it rolled. Ka-Yeon dragged it along the road to the river, and the cart rolled over the packed earth, and the pots standing on it didn't fall. The women watched, and Daniel saw on their faces the same expression they'd had when he had made fire. The impossible had become possible. The thing was moving on its own, not carried by hand, not on one's back, on wheels. Mi-Rae rode on the cart for 3 days in a row. She would sit on the edge and roll down the hill. She would squeal. Halmo watched and shook her head. But she smiled. The walking stick in her hand was now more of a habit than a necessity. Her back didn't hurt. Her legs were holding up. The bathhouse, the exercises, the warm slippers, and the herbal compresses. 63 years old. She stood up straight. Small, thin, with eyes like 2 black coals, but alive, more alive than she had been in 20 years. The first iron smelter began operating by midsummer, not a pot in a stove, a real smelting furnace, made of stone, with bellows, with clay tubes for supplying air. Ka-Yeon and Han-So worked day and night. The iron flowed, rough, impure, but it flowed. They forged tools from it: hoes, knives, axes, spearheads, sickles. Each sickle was worth 10 stone ones. Each knife was worth 20. Allied tribes came and looked at the iron as if it were a miracle. And it was a miracle. A metal the world had never known. A metal that changed everything. The second New Year was different. Not a quiet celebration by the hearth for 50 people. 1,000. The square was packed. A Christmas tree stood in the center, huge, hanging with figurines made of clay, fabric, wood, and iron. Each figurine was someone's handiwork. Mi-Rae hung a little whistling bird at the very top. Tae-Ri hung the broken tip of an arrow, the first arrow she'd shot from a bow 2 years ago. Halmo hung a small pouch of ochre. Sora hung a rag doll that Daniel had made for her daughter a year ago. The girl had outgrown the doll, but the doll remained. Ka-Yeon hung a small hammer, with her name on the handle, that very one, the first gift. Daniel looked at the tree and at every item on it, and every item was a story. Every item was a memory. The first fire, the first loaf of bread, the first arrow, the first pot, the first knife, the first house. Things for specific people. Things that said, you exist and you matter. His religion, his principle, one that worked. Yuna-Se stepped out onto the square, in front of everyone. 1,000 people stood and watched. Daniel stood by the school wall, in the warm cloak that Ka-Yeon had sewn, with obsidian around his neck, a knife at his belt. Yuna-Se wore clothes that had been made especially for her, not animal skins, fabric, dandelion patterned, dyed with a decoction of bark in dark gray, with a crescent moon embroidered on her chest, a bone comb in her hair, that very one, with a carved moon. She stood before people who had been dead 3 years ago, 47 women in the cliffs, waiting for the end. Now, there were 1,000 of them, with houses and walls and iron and bread and a school and a temple and laws and a future. Yuna-Se began to speak, in an adapted language that all 10 tribes now knew. Her voice was steady, soft, but every word reached all the way to the back row. She said that she had been taught, a woman is born to be prey. Fire is a miracle that cannot be created. In winter, someone must die, the old, the weak, or the small. She said she no longer believed in those lessons, that they had another teacher. The square was silent. 1,000 people. Silence. Yuna-Se turned to Daniel. He was standing by the wall. The obsidian around his neck glowed softly in the evening twilight. She looked at him. He looked at her. 3 years. 3 years since the day he woke up naked and burned in a ravine by the river. 3 years since the moment she raised her spear and didn't strike. 3 years of ovens and bread and walls and war and death and lullabies and soap and baths and arrows and books and wheels and laughter. 3 years during which he had gone from being a useful slave to a man without whom this world would be different. Yuna-Se smiled, not a shadow of a smile, not a ghost, a smile, a full one, an open one, the first in 6 years. The smile of a 27-year-old woman who had finally allowed herself to be more than just a leader. And she said quietly, in Korean, which she had been secretly studying for a whole year, learning at night from his diary, which she had found but never mentioned. Thank you for coming. I've been waiting for you. Daniel stood there. His eyes were wet. His throat was tight. He couldn't speak. He could only stand there, blinking, and listen to the silence of 1,000 people. And somewhere within that silence, his grandfather's voice, quiet, warm, a kind, contented man. You did the right thing. Snow began to fall, soft, quiet, white flakes on the dark walls, on people's hair, and on the branches of the fir tree, and on Yuna-Se's shoulders. 2 moons hung in the sky, a large yellow one and a small blue one. The obsidian around Daniel's neck pulsed with warmth. The word promise glowed softly. The map inside the stone pointed to a spot in the north, bright and vivid. Something was waiting there. Something ancient and powerful. Something that had been erased from this world 1,000 years ago and was now awakening. They were coming. Daniel knew it. The 3rd winter was near. Time was almost up. But he looked at the city, at the walls he had built, at the people he had fed, at the woman standing before him, smiling, at the Christmas tree with its ornaments, at the children catching snowflakes in their palms, at Halmo in his warm slippers, his eyes wet with tears, at Tae-Ri standing by the gate with a bow on her back and gloves on her hands, looking for the first time not like a wolf, at Ka-Yeon with a hammer bearing her name hanging from her belt, standing side by side with Han-So, shoulder to shoulder, at Soru, who was holding her son and daughter by the hands and looking out at the square with eyes that held no emptiness, only fullness, at Mi-Rae, who was sitting on the school roof, whistling through a whistle and waving to him, at everyone, at each and every one, at everyone. Daniel clenched the obsidian in his fist, a warm stone, a promise. He didn't know to whom he was promising. He didn't know why. He didn't know what awaited him in the north. But he knew one thing. He was here, among them. And whatever might come from the darkness beyond the mountains, whatever shadows might open their eyes in the night, they would face it together. A wall of stone and iron, a formation of spears and bows, bread in the oven and fire in the hearth, a book on the school shelf, a name written on the wall, the laughter of a child catching snowflakes. Everything he had brought into this world, everything they've built together. He stood in the snow, among his people, under 2 moons. And for the first time in 3 years, he smiled without pain. Because his grandfather was right. A well-fed man is a kind man, and a kind person is invincible. On the horizon, to the north, far beyond the mountains and forests and frozen rivers, something opened its eyes. Ancient, dark, the color of old blood. For the first time in 1,000 years, it looked toward the city of the gray moon. For the first time in 1,000 years, it saw smoke and light and heard laughter. And for the first time in 1,000 years, it paused to think. Because the last time fire burned and laughter rang out in this world, the world was different. Magic flowed in the rivers, grew in the trees, and lived in the stones. Then it was wiped away. Then darkness fell. And now, from the darkness, someone was watching the small town, with its 2 rivers, its stone wall, and the Christmas tree in the square. Watching and deciding. Snow was falling. The moons were shining. Children were laughing.